KPSS. The Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks in the period of the Stolypin reaction. The Bolsheviks constitute themselves an independent Marxist party. 190819112. 1. Stolypin reaction. Disintegration among the oppositional intelligentsia. Decadence. Desertion of a section of the party intelligentsia to the enemies of Marxism and attempts to revise the theory of Marxism. Lenin's rebuttal of the revisionists in his Materialism and Empirio criticism, and his defense of the theoretical foundations of the Marxist Party. The Second State Duma was dissolved by the Tsarist government on June 3, 1907. This is customarily referred to in history as the coup d'état of June 3. The Tsarist government issued a new law on the elections to the Third State Duma, and thus violated its own manifesto of October 17, 1905, which stipulated that new laws could be issued only with the consent of the Duma. The members of the Social Democratic group in the Second Duma were committed for trial. The representatives of the working class were condemned to penal servitude and exile. The new election law was so drafted as to increase considerably the number of representatives of the landlords and the commercial and industrial bourgeoisie in the Duma. At the same time, the representation of the peasants and workers, small as it was reduced to a fraction of its former size. Black hundreds and constitutional Democrats preponderated in the Third Duma. Of a total of 442 deputies, 171 were Rights, Black hundreds, 113 were Octobrists or members of kindred groups, 101 were constitutional Democrats or members of kindred groups, 13 were Trudoviki, and 18 were Social Democrats. The Rights, so called because they occupied the benches on the right-hand side of the Duma, represented the worst enemies of the workers and peasants, the Black Hundred feudal landlords, who had subjected the peasants to mass floggings and shootings during the SUP 97. Oppression of the peasant movement, and organizers of Jewish pogroms, of the manhandling of demonstrating workers and of the brutal burning of premises where meetings were being held during the revolution. The Rights stood for the most ruthless suppression of the working people, and for the unlimited power of the Tsar. They were opposed to the Tsar's manifesto of October 17, 1905. The Octobrist Party, or the Union of October 17, closely adhered to the Rights in the Duma. The Octobrists represented the interests of big industrial capital, and of the big landlords who ran their estates on capitalist lines. At the beginning of the Revolution of 1905, a large number of the big landlords belonging to the Constitutional Democratic Party went over to the Octobrists. The only thing that distinguished the Octobrists from the Rights was their acceptance, only in words at that, of the manifesto of October 17. The Octobrists fully supported both the home and foreign policy of the Tsarist government. The Constitutional Democratic Party had fewer seats in the Third Duma than in the First and Second Duma. This was due to the transfer of part of the landlord vote from the Constitutional Democrats to the Octobrists. There was a small group of petty bourgeois Democrats, known as Trudoviki, in the Third Duma. They vacillated between the Constitutional Democrats and the Labor Democrats, Bolsheviks. Lenin pointed out that although the Trudoviki in the Duma were extremely weak, they represented the masses, the peasant masses. The vacillation of the Trudoviki between the Constitutional Democrats and the Labor Democrats was an inevitable consequence of the class position of the small owners. Lenin set before the Bolshevik deputies, the Labor Democrats, the task of helping the weak petty bourgeois Democrats, of wresting them from the influence of the liberals, of rallying the democratic camp against the counter-revolutionary constitutional Democrats, and not only against the Rights. Lenin, Collected Works, Russ, ed., Volume 15, page 486. During the Revolution of 1905, and especially after its defeat, the Constitutional Democrats increasingly revealed themselves as a counter-revolutionary force. Discarding their democratic mask more and more, they acted like veritable monarchists, defenders of TSRdom. In 1909, a group of prominent Constitutional Democrat writers published a volume of articles entitled Veki, Landmarks, in which, on behalf of the bourgeoisie, they thanked the Tsar for crushing the revolution. Cringing and fawning upon the Tsarist government, the government of the knout and the gallows, the Constitutional Democrats bluntly stated, from Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution in this book, that we should bless this government, which alone, with its bayonets and jails, protects us, the liberal bourgeoisie, from the ire of the people. Having dispersed the Second State Duma and disposed of the Social Democratic group of the Duma, the Tsarist government zealously set about destroying the political and economic organizations of the proletariat. Convict prisons, fortresses and places of exile were filled to overflowing with revolutionaries. They were brutally beaten up in the prisons, tormented and tortured. The Black Hundred terror raged unchecked. The Tsar's minister Stolypin set up gallows all over the country. Several thousand revolutionaries were executed. In those days the gallows was known as the Stolypin necktie. In its efforts to crush the revolutionary movement of the workers and peasants, the Tsarist government could not confine itself to acts of repression, punitive expeditions, shootings, jailings and sentences of penal servitude. It perceived with alarm that the naive faith of the peasants in the Little Father, the Tsar, was steadily vanishing. It therefore resorted to a broad maneuver. It conceived the idea of creating a solid support for itself in the countryside, in the large class of rural bourgeoisie, the kulaks. On November 9, I 906, Stolypin issued a new agrarian law enabling the peasants to leave the communes and to set up separate farms. Stolypin's agrarian law broke down the system of communal land tenure. The peasants were invited to take possession of their allotments as private property and to withdraw from the communes. They could now sell their allotments, which they were not allowed to do before. When a peasant left his commune, the latter was obliged to allot land to him in a single tract, kudur, otrub. The rich peasants, the kulaks, now had the opportunity to buy up the land of the poor peasants at low prices. Within a few years after the promulgation of the law, over 1 million poor peasants had lost their land altogether and had been completely ruined. As the poor peasants lost their land, the number of kulak farmholds grew. These were sometimes regular estates employing hired labor, farmhands, on a large scale. The government compelled the peasants to allot the best land of the communes to the kulak farmers. During the emancipation of the peasants, the landlords had robbed the peasants of their land. Now the kulaks began to rob the communes of their land, securing the best plots and buying up the allotments of poor peasants at low prices. The Tsarist government advanced large loans to the kulaks for the purchase of land and the outfitting of their farms. Stolypin wanted to turn the kulaks into small landlords, into loyal defenders of the Tsarist autocracy. In the 9 years 1906 to 15 alone, over 2 million households withdrew from the communes. As a result of the Stolypin policy, the condition of the peasants with small land allotments, and of the poor peasants, grew worse than ever. The process of differentiation among the peasantry became more marked. The peasants began to come into collision with the kulak farmers. At the same time, the peasants began to realize that they would never gain possession of the landed estates as long as the Tsarist government and the State Duma of the landlords and constitutional democrats existed. During the period when kulak farmholds were being formed in large numbers, 1907 to 09, the peasant movement began to decline, but soon after, in 1910, 1911, and later, owing to the clashes between the members of the village communes and the kulak farmers, the peasant movement against the landlords and the kulak farmers grew in intensity. There were big changes also in industry after the revolution. The concentration of industry in the hands of increasingly powerful capitalist groups proceeded much more rapidly. Even before the revolution of 1905, the capitalists had begun to form associations with the object of raising prices within the country and of using the super profits thus obtained for the encouragement of export trade so as to enable them to dump goods abroad at low prices and to capture foreign markets. These capitalist associations, monopolies, were called trusts and syndicates. After the revolution, their number became still greater. There was also an increase in the number of big banks, whose role in industry became more important. The flow of foreign capital into Russia increased. Thus capitalism in Russia was turning into monopoly capitalism, imperialist capitalism, on a growing scale. After several years of stagnation, industry began to revive. The output of coal, metal, oil, textiles and sugar increased. Grain exports assumed large dimensions. Although Russia at that time made some industrial progress, she was still backward compared with Western Europe, and still dependent on foreign capitalists. Russia did not produce machinery and machine tools, they were imported from abroad. She had no automobile industry or chemical industry, she did not produce artificial fertilizers. Russia also lagged behind other capitalist countries in the manufacture of armaments. Pointing to the low level of consumption of metals in Russia as an indication of the country's backwardness, Lenin wrote, "In the half-century following the emancipation of the peasants, the consumption of iron in Russia has increased five-fold. Yet Russia remains an incredibly and unprecedentedly backward country, poverty-stricken and semi-barbaric, equipped with modern implements of production to 1/4 the extent of England, 1/5 the extent of Germany, and 1/10 the extent of America." Lenin. Collected Works, Russ. ed. Volume 16, page 543. One direct result of Russia's economic and political backwardness was the dependence both of Russian capitalism and of TSRDM itself on West European capitalism. This found expression in the fact that such highly important branches of industry as coal, oil, electrical equipment, and metallurgy were in the hands of foreign capital, and that Tsarist Russia had to import nearly all her machinery and equipment from abroad. It also found expression in the fettering foreign loans. To pay interest on these loans, TSRDM squeezed hundreds of millions of rubles out of the people annually. It moreover found expression in the secret treaties with Russia's allies, by which the Tsarist government undertook in the event of war to send millions of Russian soldiers to support the allies on the imperialist fronts and to protect the tremendous profits of the British in French capitalists. The period of the Stolypin reaction was marked by particularly savage assaults on the working class by the gendarmerie and police, the Tsarist agents, provocateurs and Black Hundred ruffians. But it was not only the underlings of the Tsar who harassed and persecuted the workers. No less zealous in this respect were the factory and mill owners, whose offensive against the working class became particularly aggressive in the years of industrial stagnation and increasing unemployment. The factory owners declared mass lockouts and drew up black lists of class-conscious workers who took an active part in strikes. Once a person was blacklisted, he could never hope to find employment in any of the plants belonging to the Manufacturers Association in that particular branch of industry. Already in 1908 wage rates were cut by 10 to 15%. The working day was everywhere increased to 10 or 12 hours. The system of rapacious fines again flourished. Elution. Degenerate and decadent tendencies grew particularly marked among the intelligentsia. The fellow travelers who came from the bourgeois camp to join the movement during the upsurge of the revolution deserted the party in the days of reaction. Some of them joined the camp of the open enemies of the revolution, others entrenched themselves in such legally functioning working-class societies as still survived, and endeavored to divert the proletariat from the path of revolution and to discredit the revolutionary party of the proletariat. Deserting the revolution, the fellow travelers tried to win the good graces of the reactionaries and to live in peace with TSRdom. The Tsarist government took advantage of the defeat of the revolution to enlist the more cowardly and self-seeking fellow travelers of the revolution as agents provocateurs. These vile Judases were sent by the Tsarist Okhrana into the working class and party organizations, where they spied from within and betrayed revolutionaries. The offensive of the counter-revolution was waged on the ideological front as well. There appeared a whole horde of fashionable writers who criticized Marxism and demolished it, mocked and scoffed at the revolution, extolled treachery, and lauded sexual depravity under the guise of the cult of individuality. In the realm of philosophy, increasing attempts were made to criticize and revise Marxism. There also appeared all sorts of religious trends camouflaged by pseudo-scientific theories. Criticizing Marxism became fashionable. All these gentlemen, despite their multifarious coloring, pursued one common aim: to divert the masses from the revolution. Decadence and skepticism also affected a section of the party intelligentsia, those who considered themselves Marxists but had never held firmly to the Marxist position. Among them were writers like Bogdanov, Bazarov, Lunacharsky, who had sided with the Bolsheviks in 1905. Yushkevich and Valentinov, Mensheviks. They launched their criticism simultaneously against the philosophical foundations of Marxist theory, i.e., against dialectical materialism and against the fundamental Marxist principles of historical science, i.e., against historical materialism. This criticism differed from the usual criticism in that it was not conducted openly and squarely, but in a veiled and hypocritical form under the guise of defending the fundamental positions of Marxism. These people claimed that in the main they were Marxists, but that they wanted to improve Marxism by ridding it of certain of its fundamental principles. In reality, they were hostile to Marxism, for they tried to undermine its theoretical foundations, although they hypocritically denied their hostility to Marxism and two-facedly continued to style themselves Marxists. The danger of this hypocritical criticism lay in the fact that it was calculated to deceive rank-and-file members of the party and might lead them astray. The more hypocritical grew this criticism, which aimed at undermining the theoretical foundations of Marxism, the more dangerous it was to the party, for the more it merged with the general campaign of the reactionaries against the party, against the revolution. Some of the intellectuals who had deserted Marxism went so far as to advocate the founding of a new religion. These were known as God-seekers and God-builders. It became urgent for the Marxists to give a fitting retort to these renegades from Marxist theory, to tear the mask from their faces and thoroughly expose them, and thus safeguard the theoretical foundations of the Marxist party. One might have thought that this task would have been undertaken by Plekhanov and his Menshevik friends who regarded themselves as eminent Marxist theoreticians, but they preferred to fire off one or two insignificant critical notes of the newspaper type and quit the field. It was Lenin who accomplished this task in his famous book Materialism and Empirio-Criticism, published in 1909. In the course of less than half a year, Lenin wrote 4 books devoted mainly and almost entirely to attacks on dialectical materialism have made their appearance. These include, first and foremost, studies in, it would have been more proper to say, against, the philosophy of Marxism, St. Petersburg, 1908, a symposium by Bazarov, Bogdanov, Lunacharsky, Berman, Helfand, Yushkevich and Suvorov. Yushkevich's Materialism and Critical Realism. Berman's Dialectics in the Light of the Modern Theory of Knowledge and Valentinov's The Philosophic Constructions of Marxism. All these people, who, despite the sharp divergence of their political views, are united in their hostility toward dialectical materialism, at the same time claim to be Marxists in philosophy. Engels' dialectics is mysticism, says Berman. Engels' views have become antiquated, remarks Bazarov casually, as though it were a self-evident fact. Materialism thus appears to be refuted by our bold warriors, who proudly allude to the modern theory of knowledge, recent philosophy, or recent positivism, the philosophy of modern natural science, or even the philosophy of natural science of the 20th century. Lenin, Selected Works, Volume 11, page 89. Replying to Lunacharsky, who, in justification of his friends, the revisionists in philosophy, said, "Perhaps we have gone astray, but we are seeking," Lenin wrote. "As for myself, I too am a seeker in philosophy. Namely, the task I have set myself in these comments, i.e., materialism and empirio-criticism, ed., is to find out what was the stumbling block to these people who under the guise of Marxism are offering something incredibly muddled, confused and reactionary." Ibid. Page 90. But as a matter of fact, Lenin's book went far beyond this modest task. Actually, the book is something more than a criticism of Bogdanov, Yushkevich, Bazarov and Valentinov and their teachers in philosophy, Avenarius and Mach, who endeavored in their writings to offer a refined and polished idealism as opposed to Marxist materialism. It is at the same time a defense of the theoretical foundations of Marxism, dialectical and historical materialism, and a materialist generalization of everything important and essential acquired by science, and especially the natural sciences, in the course of a whole historical period, the period from Engels' death to the appearance of Lenin's materialism and empirio-criticism. Having effectively criticized in this book the Russian empirio-criticists and their foreign teachers, Lenin comes to the following conclusions regarding philosophical and theoretical revisionism. 1. An ever subtler falsification of Marxism, an ever subtler presentation of anti-materialist doctrines under the guise of Marxism. This is the characteristic feature of modern revisionism in political economy, in questions of tactics and in philosophy generally. Ibid. Page 382. 2. The whole school of Mach and Avenarius is moving towards idealism. Ibid. Page 406. 3. Our Machians have all got stuck in idealism. Ibid. p. 396. 4. Behind the gnoseological scholasticism of empirio-criticism it is impossible not to see the struggle of parties in philosophy, a struggle which in the last analysis expresses the tendencies and ideology of the antagonistic classes in modern society. Ibid. Page 407. 5. The objective, class role of empirio-criticism reduces itself to nothing but that of servitor of the fightists, the reactionaries who hold faith above science, ed., in their struggle against materialism in general and historical materialism in particular. Ibid. Page 407. 6. Philosophical idealism is a road to clerical obscurantism. Ibid. Page 84. In order to appreciate the tremendous part played by Lenin's book in the history of our party and to realize what theoretical treasure Lenin safeguarded from the motley crowd of revisionists and renegades of the period of the Stolypin reaction, we must acquaint ourselves, if only briefly, with the fundamentals of dialectical and historical materialism. This is all the more necessary because dialectical and historical materialism constitute the theoretical basis of communism, the theoretical foundations of the Marxist Party, and it is the duty of every active member of our party to know these principles and hence to study them. What, then, is 1. Dialectical materialism? 2. Historical materialism? 2. Dialectical and historical materialism. Dialectical materialism is the world outlook of the Marxist-Leninist Party. It is called dialectical materialism because its approach to the phenomena of nature, its method of studying and apprehending them, is dialectical, while its interpretation of the phenomena of nature, its conception of these phenomena, its theory, is materialistic. Historical materialism is the extension of the principles of dialectical materialism to the study of social life, an application of the principles of dialectical materialism to the phenomena of the life of society, to the study of society and its history. When describing their dialectical method, Marx and Engels usually referred to Hegel as the philosopher who formulated the main features of dialectics. This, however, does not mean that the dialectics of Marx and Engels is identical with the dialectics of Hegel. As a matter of fact, Marx and Engels took from the Hegelian dialectics only its rational kernel, casting aside its idealistic shell, and developed it further so as to lend it a modern scientific form. My dialectic method, says Marx, is fundamentally not only different from the Hegelian, but is its direct opposite. To Hegel, the process of thinking, which, under the name of the idea, he even transforms into an independent subject, is the demiurge creator of the real world, and the real world is only the external, phenomenal form of the idea. With me, on the contrary, the ideal is nothing else than the material world reflected by the human mind, and translated into forms of thought. Karl Marx, Capital, Volume I, page XXX. International Publishers, 1939. When describing their materialism, Marx and Engels usually refer to Feuerbach as the philosopher who restored materialism to its rights. This, however, does not mean that the materialism of Marx and Engels is identical with Feuerbach's materialism. As a matter of fact, Marx and Engels took from Feuerbach's materialism its inner kernel, developed it into a scientific philosophical theory of materialism and cast aside its idealistic and religious ethical encumbrances. We know that Feuerbach, although he was fundamentally a materialist, objected to the name materialism. Engels more than once declared that, in spite of the materialist foundation, Feuerbach remained bound by the traditional idealist fetters, and that, the real idealism of Feuerbach becomes evident as soon as we come to his philosophy of religion and ethics. Karl Marx. Selected Works, Volume 1, pp. 439-442. Dialectics comes from the Greek dialego, to discourse, to debate. In ancient times, dialectics was the art of arriving at the truth by disclosing the contradictions in the argument of an opponent and overcoming these contradictions. There were philosophers in ancient times who believed that the disclosure of contradictions in thought and the clash of opposite opinions was the best method of arriving at the truth. This dialectical method of thought, later extended to the phenomena of nature, developed into the dialectical method of apprehending nature, which regards the phenomena of nature as being in constant movement and undergoing constant change, and the development of nature as the result of the development of the contradictions in nature, as the result of the interaction of opposed forces in nature. In its essence, dialectics is the direct opposite of metaphysics. 1. The principal features of the Marxist dialectical method are as follows. A. Contrary to metaphysics, dialectics does not regard nature as an accidental agglomeration of things, of phenomena, unconnected with, isolated from, and independent of, each other, but as a connected and integral whole, in which things, phenomena, are organically connected with, dependent on, and determined by, each other. The dialectical method therefore holds that no phenomenon in nature can be understood if taken by itself, isolated from surrounding phenomena, inasmuch as any phenomenon in any realm of nature may become meaningless to us if it is not considered in connection with the surrounding conditions, but divorced from them, and that, vice versa, any phenomenon can be understood and explained if considered in its inseparable connection with surrounding phenomena, as one conditioned by surrounding phenomena. Continuous movement and change, of continuous renewal and development, where something is always arising and developing, and something always disintegrating and dying away. The dialectical method therefore requires that phenomena should be considered not only from the standpoint of their interconnection and interdependence, but also from the standpoint of their movement, their change, their development, their coming into being and going out of being. The dialectical method regards as important primarily not that which at the given moment seems to be durable and yet is already beginning to die away, but that which is arising and developing, even though at the given moment it may appear to be not durable, for the dialectical method considers invincible only that which is arising and developing. All nature, says Engels, from the smallest thing to the biggest, from a grain of sand to the sun, from the protista, the primary living cell, ed. to man, is in a constant state of coming into being and going out of being, in a constant flux, in a ceaseless state of movement and change. F. Engels, Dialectics of Nature. Therefore, dialectics, Engels says, takes things and their perceptual images essentially in their interconnection, in their concatenation, in their movement, in their rise and disappearance. Ibid. C. Contrary to metaphysics, dialectics does not regard the process of development as a simple process of growth, where quantitative changes do not lead to qualitative changes, but as a development which passes from insignificant and imperceptible quantitative changes to open, fundamental changes, to qualitative changes. A development in which the qualitative changes occur not gradually, but rapidly and abruptly, taking the form of a leap from one state to another. They occur not accidentally but as the natural result of an accumulation of imperceptible and gradual quantitative changes. The dialectical method therefore holds that the process of development should be understood not as movement in a circle, not as a simple repetition of what has already occurred, but as an onward and upward movement, as a transition from an old qualitative state to a new qualitative state, as a development from the simple to the complex, from the lower to the higher. Nature, says Engels, is the test of dialectics, and it must be said for modern natural science that it has furnished extremely rich and daily increasing materials for this test, and has thus proved that in the last analysis nature's process is dialectical and not metaphysical. That it does not move in an eternally uniform and constantly repeated circle, but passes through a real history. Here prime mention should be made of Darwin, who dealt a severe blow to the metaphysical conception of nature by proving that the organic world of today, plants and animals, and consequently man too, is all a product of a process of development that has been in progress for millions of years. F. Engels, Anti-Düring. Describing dialectical development as a transition from quantitative changes to qualitative changes, Engels says. In physics, every change is a passing of quantity into quality, as a result of quantitative change of some form of movement either inherent in a body or imparted to it. For example, the temperature of water has at first no effect on its liquid state, but as the temperature of liquid water rises or falls, a moment arrives when this state of cohesion changes and the water is converted in one case into steam and in the other into ice. A definite minimum current is required to make a platinum wire glow. Every metal has its melting temperature. Every liquid has a definite freezing point and boiling point at a given pressure, as far as we are able with the means at our disposal to attain the required temperatures. Finally, every gas has its critical point at which, by proper pressure and cooling, it can be converted into a liquid state. What are known as the constants of physics, the point at which one state passes into another, ed. are in most cases nothing but designations for the nodal points at which a quantitative change, increase or decrease of movement causes a qualitative change in the state of the given body, and at which, consequently, quantity is transformed into quality. Dialectics of nature. Passing to chemistry, Engels continues. Chemistry may be called the science of the qualitative changes which take place in bodies as the effect of changes of quantitative composition. This was already known to Hegel. Take oxygen. If the molecule contains 3 atoms instead of the customary 2, we get ozone, a body definitely distinct in odor and reaction from ordinary oxygen. And what shall we say of the different proportions in which oxygen combines with nitrogen or sulfur, and each of which produces a body qualitatively different from all other bodies, Ibid. Finally, criticizing Düring, who scolded Hegel for all he was worth, but surreptitiously borrowed from him the well-known thesis that the transition from the insentient world to the sentient world, from the kingdom of inorganic matter to the kingdom of organic life, is a leap to a new state, Engels says. This is precisely the Hegelian nodal line of measure relations, in which, at certain definite nodal points, the purely quantitative increase or decrease gives rise to a qualitative leap. For example, in the case of water which is heated or cooled, where boiling point and freezing point are the nodes at which, under normal pressure, the leap to a new aggregate state takes place, and where consequently quantity is transformed into quality. F. Engels, anti-Düring. D. Contrary to metaphysics, dialectics holds that internal contradictions are inherent in all things and phenomena of nature, for they all have their negative and positive sides, a past and a future, something dying away and something developing. And that the struggle between these opposites, the struggle between the old and the new, between that which is dying away and that which is being born, between that which is disappearing and that which is developing, constitutes the internal content of the process of development, the internal content of the transformation of quantitative changes into qualitative changes. The dialectical method therefore holds that the process of development from the lower to the higher takes place not as a harmonious unfolding of phenomena, but as a disclosure of the contradictions inherent in things and phenomena, as a struggle of opposite tendencies which operate on the basis of these contradictions. In its proper meaning, Lenin says, dialectics is the study of the contradiction within the very essence of things. Lenin, Philosophical Notebooks, Russ. ed. Page 263. And further, development is the struggle of opposites. Lenin, Selected Works, Volume 11, pp. 81-2. Such, in brief, are the principal features of the Marxist dialectical method. It is easy to understand how immensely important is the extension of the principles of the dialectical method to the study of social life and the history of society, and how immensely important is the application of these principles to the history of society and to the practical activities of the party of the proletariat. If there are no isolated phenomena in the world, if all phenomena are interconnected and interdependent, then it is clear that every social system and every social movement in history must be evaluated not from the standpoint of eternal justice, or some other preconceived idea, as is not infrequently done by historians, but from the standpoint of the conditions which gave rise to that system or that social movement and with which they are connected. The slave system would be senseless, stupid and unnatural under modern conditions. But under the conditions of a disintegrating primitive communal system, the slave system is a quite understandable and natural phenomenon, since it represents an advance on the primitive communal system. The demand for a bourgeois democratic republic when T.S. Artem and bourgeois society existed, as, let us say, in Russia in 1905, was a quite understandable, proper and revolutionary demand, for at that time a bourgeois republic would have meant a step forward. But now, under the conditions of the USSR, the demand for a bourgeois democratic republic would be a meaningless and counter-revolutionary demand, for a bourgeois republic would be a retrograde step compared with the Soviet Republic. Everything depends on the conditions, time and place. It is clear that without such a historical approach to social phenomena, the existence and development of the science of history is impossible, for only such an approach saves the science of history from becoming a jumble of accidents and an agglomeration of most absurd mistakes. Further, if the world is in a state of constant movement and development, if the dying away of the old and the upgrowth of the new is a law of development, then it is clear that there can be no immutable social systems, no eternal principles of private property and exploitation, no eternal ideas of the subjugation of the peasant to the landlord, of the worker to the capitalist. Hence the capitalist system can be replaced by the socialist system, just as at one time the feudal system was replaced by the capitalist system. Hence we must not base our orientation on the strata of society which are no longer developing, even though they at present constitute the predominant force, but on those strata which are developing and have a future before them, even though they at present do not constitute the predominant force. In the 80s of the past century, in the period of the struggle between the Marxists and the Narodniks, the proletariat in Russia constituted an insignificant minority of the population, whereas the individual peasants constituted the vast majority of the population. But the proletariat was developing as a class, whereas the peasantry as a class was disintegrating. And just because the proletariat was developing as a class, the Marxists based their orientation on the proletariat. And they were not mistaken, for, as we know, the proletariat subsequently grew from an insignificant force into a first-rate historical and political force. Hence, in order not to err in policy, one must look forward, not backward. Further, if the passing of slow quantitative changes into rapid and abrupt qualitative changes is a law of development, then it is clear that revolutions made by oppressed classes are a quite natural and inevitable phenomenon. Hence the transition from capitalism to socialism and the liberation of the working class from the yoke of capitalism cannot be effected by slow changes, by reforms, but only by a qualitative change of the capitalist system, by revolution. Hence, in order not to err in policy, one must be a revolutionary, not a reformist. Further, if development proceeds by way of the disclosure of internal contradictions, by way of collisions between opposite forces on the basis of these contradictions and so as to overcome these contradictions, then it is clear that the class struggle of the proletariat is a quite natural and inevitable phenomenon. Hence we must not cover up the contradictions of the capitalist system, but disclose and unravel them. We must not try to check the class struggle but carry it to its conclusion. Hence, in order not to err in policy, one must pursue an uncompromising proletarian class policy, not a reformist policy of harmony of the interests of the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, not a compromiser's policy of the growing of capitalism into socialism. Such is the Marxist dialectical method when applied to social life, to the history of society. As to Marxist philosophical materialism, it is fundamentally the direct opposite of philosophical idealism. 2. The principal features of Marxist philosophical materialism are as follows. A. Contrary to idealism, which regards the world as the embodiment of an absolute idea, a universal spirit, consciousness, Marxist philosophical materialism holds that the world is by its very nature material, that the multifold phenomena of the world constitute different forms of matter in motion, that interconnection and interdependence of phenomena, as established by the dialectical method, are a law of the development of moving matter, and that the world develops in accordance with the laws of movement of matter and stands in no need of a universal spirit. The materialist world outlook, says Engels, is simply the conception of nature as it is, without any reservations. M.S. of Ludwig. Feuerbach. Speaking of the materialist views of the ancient philosopher Heraclitus, who held that the world, the all-in-one, was not created by any god or any man, but was, is and ever will be a living flame, systematically flaring up and systematically dying down. Lenin comments. A very good exposition of the rudiments of dialectical materialism. Lenin. Philosophical Notebooks, Russ. ed. Page 318. B. Contrary to idealism, which asserts that only our mind really exists, and that the material world, being, nature, exists only in our mind, in our sensations, ideas and perceptions, the Marxist materialist philosophy holds that matter, nature, being, is an objective reality existing outside and independent of our mind. That matter is primary, since it is the source of sensations, ideas, mind, and that mind is secondary, derivative, since it is a reflection of matter, a reflection of being. That thought is a product of matter which in its development has reached a high degree of perfection, namely, of the brain, and the brain is the organ of thought. And that therefore one cannot separate thought from matter without committing a grave error, Engels says. The question of the relation of thinking to being, the relation of spirit to nature is the paramount question of the whole of philosophy. The answers which the philosophers gave to this question split them into two great camps. Those who asserted the primacy of spirit to nature comprised the camp of idealism. The others, who regarded nature as primary, belonged to the various schools of materialism. Karl Marx, Selected Works, Volume I, pp. 430-31. And further, the material, sensuously perceptible world to which we ourselves belong is the only reality. Our consciousness and thinking, however supra-sensuous they may seem, are the product of a material, bodily organ, the brain. Matter is not a product of mind, but mind itself is merely the highest product of matter. Ibid. Page 435. Concerning the question of matter and thought, Marx says, it is impossible to separate thought from matter that thinks. Matter is the subject of all changes. Ibid. Page 397. Describing the Marxist philosophy of materialism, Lenin says, materialism in general recognizes objectively real being, matter, as independent of consciousness, sensation, experience. Consciousness is only the reflection of being, at best, and approximately true. Adequate, ideally exact, reflection of it. Lenin, Selected Works. Volume 11, page 378. And further, a. Matter is that which, acting upon our sense organs, produces sensation. Matter is the objective reality given to us in sensation. Matter, nature, being, the physical, is primary, and spirit, consciousness, sensation, the psychical, is secondary. Ibid. pp. 208, 209. B. The world picture is a picture of how matter moves and of how matter thinks. Ibid. Page 403. C. The brain is the organ of thought. Ibid. Page 125. C. Contrary to idealism, which denies the possibility of knowing the world and its laws, which does not believe in the authenticity of our knowledge, does not recognize objective truth, and holds that the world is full of things in themselves that can never be known to science. Marxist philosophical materialism holds that the world and its laws are fully knowable, that our knowledge of the laws of nature, tested by experiment and practice, is authentic knowledge having the validity of objective truth, and that there are no things in the world which are unknowable, but only things which are still not known, but which will be disclosed and made known by the efforts of science and practice. Criticizing the thesis of Kant and other idealists that the world is unknowable and that there are things in themselves which are unknowable, and defending the well-known materialist thesis that our knowledge is authentic knowledge, Engels writes. The most telling refutation of this as of all other philosophical fancies is practice, viz., experiment and industry. If we are able to prove the correctness of our conception of a natural process by making it ourselves, bringing it into being out of its conditions and using it for our own purposes into the bargain, then there is an end of the Kantian thing in itself. The chemical substances produced in the bodies of plants and animals remained such things in themselves until organic chemistry began to produce them one after another, whereupon the thing in itself became a thing for us, as for instance, alizarin, the coloring matter of the matter, which we no longer trouble to grow in the matter roots in the field, but produce much more cheaply and simply from coal tar. For 300 years the Copernican solar system was a hypothesis, with 100, 1,000 or 10,000 chances to 1 in its favor, but still always a hypothesis. But when Leverrier, by means of the data provided by this system, not only deduced the necessity of the existence of an unknown planet, but also calculated the position in the heavens which this planet must, from Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution necessarily occupy, and when Gale really found this planet, the Copernican system was proved. Karl Marx, Selected Works, Volume I, pp. 432-33. Accusing Bogdanov, Bazarov, Yushkevich and the other followers of Mach of fideism, and defending the well-known materialist thesis that our scientific knowledge of the laws of nature is authentic knowledge, and that the laws of science represent objective truth, Lenin says. Contemporary fideism does not at all reject science. All it rejects is the exaggerated claims of science, to wit, its claim to objective truth. If objective truth exists, as the materialists think, if natural science, reflecting the outer world in human experience, is alone capable of giving us objective truth, then all fideism is absolutely refuted. Lenin, Selected Works, Volume 11, p. I-89. Such, in brief, are the characteristic features of the Marxist philosophical materialism. It is easy to understand how immensely important is the extension of the principles of philosophical materialism to the study of social life, of the history of society, and how immensely important is the application of these principles to the history of society and to the practical activities of the Party of the Proletariat. If the connection between the phenomena of nature and their interdependence are laws of the development of nature, it follows, too, that the connection and interdependence of the phenomena of social life are laws of the development of society, and not something accidental. Hence social life, the history of society, ceases to be an agglomeration of accidents, and becomes the history of the development of society according to regular laws, and the study of the history of society becomes a science. Hence the practical activity of the Party of the Proletariat must not be based on the good wishes of outstanding individuals, not on the dictates of reason, universal morals, etc., but on the laws of development of society and on the study of these laws. Further, if the world is knowable and our knowledge of the laws of development of nature is authentic knowledge, having the validity of objective truth, it follows that social life, the development of society, is also knowable, and that the data of science regarding the laws of development of society are authentic data having the validity of objective truths. Hence the science of the history of society, despite all the complexity of the phenomena of social life, can become as precise a science as, let us say, biology, and capable of making use of the laws of development of society for practical purposes. Hence the Party of the Proletariat should not guide itself in its practical activity by casual motives, but by the laws of development of society, and by practical deductions from these laws. Hence socialism is converted from a dream of a better future for humanity into a science. Hence the bond between science and practical activity, between theory and practice, their unity, should be the guiding star of the Party of the Proletariat. Further, if nature, being, the material world, is primary, and mind, thought, is secondary, derivative. If the material world represents objective reality existing independently of the mind of men, while the mind is a reflection of this objective reality, it follows that the material life of society, its being, is also primary, and its spiritual life secondary, derivative, and that the material life of society is an objective reality existing independently of the will of men, while the spiritual life of society is a reflection of this objective reality, a reflection of being. Hence the source of formation of the spiritual life of society, the origin of social ideas, social theories, political views and political institutions, should not be sought for in the ideas, theories, views and political institutions themselves, but in the conditions of the material life of society, in social being, of which these ideas, theories, views, etc., are the reflection. Hence, if in different periods of the history of society different social ideas, theories, views and political institutions are to be observed, if under the slave system we encounter certain social ideas, theories, views and political institutions, under feudalism others, and under capitalism others still, this is not to be explained by the nature, the properties, of the ideas, theories, views and political institutions themselves but by the different conditions of the material life of society at different periods of social development. Whatever is the being of a society, whatever are the conditions of material life of a society, such are the ideas, theories, political views and political institutions of that society. In this connection, Marx says, "It is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but, on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness." Karl Marx, Selected Works, Volume I, page 356. Hence, in order not to err in policy, in order not to find itself in the position of idle dreamers, the party of the proletariat must not base its activities on abstract principles of human reason, but on the concrete conditions of the material life of society, as the determining force of social development, not on the good wishes of great men, but on the real needs of development of the material life of society. The fall of the utopians, including the Narodniks, anarchists and socialist revolutionaries, was due, among other things, to the fact that they did not recognize the primary role which the conditions of the material life of society play in the development of society, and, sinking to idealism, did not base their practical activities on the needs of the development of the material life of society, but, independently of and in spite of these needs, on ideal plans and all-embracing projects, divorced from the real life of society. The strength and vitality of Marxism-Leninism lie in the fact that it does base its practical activity on the needs of the development of the material life of society and never divorces itself from the real life of society. It does not follow from Marx's words, however, that social ideas, theories, political views and political institutions are of no significance in the life of society, that they do not reciprocally affect social being, the development of the material conditions of the life of society. We have been speaking so far of the origin of social ideas, theories, views and political institutions, of the way they arise, of the fact that the spiritual life of society is a reflection of the conditions of its material life. As regards the significance of social ideas, theories, views and political institutions, as regards their role in history, historical materialism, far from denying them, stresses the role and importance of these factors in the life of society, in its history. There are different kinds of social ideas and theories. There are old ideas and theories which have outlived their day and which serve the interests of the moribund forces of society. Their significance lies in the fact that they hamper the development, the progress of society. Then there are new and advanced ideas and theories which serve the interests of the advanced forces of society. Their significance lies in the fact that they facilitate the development, the progress of society, and their significance is the greater the more accurately they reflect the needs of development of the material life of society. New social ideas and theories arise only after the development of the material life of society has set new tasks before society. But once they have arisen, they become a most potent force which facilitates the carrying out of the new tasks set by the development of the material life of society, a force which facilitates the progress of society. It is precisely here that the tremendous organizing, mobilizing and transforming value of new ideas, new theories, new political views and new political institutions manifests itself. New social ideas and theories arise precisely because they are necessary to society, because it is impossible to carry out the urgent tasks of development of the material life of society without their organizing, mobilizing and transforming action. Arising out of the new tasks set by the development of the material life of society, the new social ideas and theories force their way through, become the possession of the masses, mobilize and organize them against the moribund forces of society, and thus facilitate the overthrow of these forces which hamper the development of the material life of society. Thus social ideas, theories and political institutions, having arisen on the basis of the urgent tasks of the development of the material life of society, the development of social being, themselves then react upon social being, upon the material life of society, creating the conditions necessary for completely carrying out the urgent tasks of the material life of society, and for rendering its further development possible. In this connection, Marx says, "Theory becomes a material force as soon as it has gripped the masses. Zur Kritik der Hegelschen Rechtsphilosophie." Hence, in order to be able to influence the conditions of material life of society and to accelerate their development and their improvement, the party of the proletariat must rely upon such a social theory, such a social idea as correctly reflects the needs of development of the material life of society, and which is therefore capable of setting into motion broad masses of the people and of mobilizing them and organizing them into a great army of the proletarian party, prepared to smash the reactionary forces and to clear the way for the advanced forces of society. The fall of the economists and Mensheviks was due among other things to the fact that they did not recognize the mobilizing, organizing and transforming role of advanced theory, of advanced ideas and, sinking to vulgar materialism, reduced the role of these factors almost to nothing, thus condemning the party to passivity and inanition. The strength and vitality of Marxism-Leninism are derived from the fact that it relies upon an advanced theory which correctly reflects the needs of development of the material life of society, that it elevates theory to a proper level, and that it deems it its duty to utilize every ounce of the mobilizing, organizing and transforming power of this theory. That is the answer historical materialism gives to the question of the relation between social being and social consciousness, between the conditions of development of material life and the development of the spiritual life of society. It now remains to elucidate the following question. What, from the viewpoint of historical materialism, is meant by the conditions of material life of society, which in the final analysis determine the physiognomy of society, its ideas, views, political institutions, etc.? What, after all, are these conditions of material life of society? What are their distinguishing features? There can be no doubt that the concept, conditions of material life of society, includes, first of all, nature which surrounds society, geographical environment, which is one of the indispensable and constant conditions of material life of society and which, of course, influences the development of society. What role does geographical environment play in the development of society? Is geographical environment the chief force determining the physiognomy of society, the character of the social system of men, the transition from one system to another? Historical materialism answers this question in the negative. Geographical environment is unquestionably one of the constant and indispensable conditions of development of society and, of course, influences the development of society, accelerates or retards its development. But its influence is not the determining influence, inasmuch as the changes and development of society proceed at an incomparably faster rate than the changes and development of geographical environment. In the space of 3,000 years, 3 different social systems have been successively superseded in Europe: the primitive communal system, the slave system and the feudal system. In the eastern part of Europe, in the USSR, even 4 social systems have been superseded. Yet during this period geographical conditions in Europe have either not changed at all, or have changed so slightly that geography takes no note of them. And that is quite natural. Changes in geographical environment of any importance require millions of years, whereas a few hundred or a couple of thousand years are enough for even very important changes in the system of human society. It follows from this that geographical environment cannot be the chief cause, the determining cause of social development, for that which remains almost unchanged in the course of tens of thousands of years cannot be the chief cause of development of that which undergoes fundamental changes in the course of a few hundred years. Further, there can be no doubt that the concept, conditions of material life of society, also includes growth of population, density of population of one degree or another, for people are an essential element of the conditions of material life of society, and without a definite minimum number of people there can be no material life of society. Is not growth of population the chief force that determines the character of the social system of man? Historical materialism answers this question too in the negative. Of course, growth of population does influence the development of society, does facilitate or retard the development of society, but it cannot be the chief force of development of society, and its influence on the development of society cannot be the determining influence because, by itself, growth of population does not furnish the clue to the question why a given social system is replaced precisely by such and such a new system and not by another, why the primitive communal system is succeeded precisely by the slave system by the feudal system, and the feudal system by the bourgeois system, and not by some other. If growth of population were the determining force of social development, then a higher density of population would be bound to give rise to a correspondingly higher type of social system. But we do not find this to be the case. The density of population in China is 4 times as great as in the USA, yet the USA stands higher than China in the scale of social development, for in China a semi-feudal system still prevails, whereas the USA has long ago reached the highest stage of development of capitalism. The density of population in Belgium is 19 times as great as in the USA, and 26 times as great as in the USSR. Yet the USA stands higher than Belgium in the scale of social development, and as for the USSR, Belgium lags a whole historical epoch behind this country, for in Belgium the capitalist system prevails, whereas the USSR has already done away with capitalism and has set up a socialist system. It follows from this that growth of population is not, and cannot be, the chief force of development of society, the force which determines the character of the social system, the physiognomy of society. What, then, is the chief force in the complex of conditions of material life of society which determines the physiognomy of society, the character of the social system, the development of society from one system to another? This force, historical materialism holds, is the method of procuring the means of life necessary for human existence, the mode of production of material values, food, clothing, footwear, houses, fuel, instruments of production, etc., which are indispensable for the life of development of society. In order to live, People must have food, clothing, footwear, shelter, fuel, etc. In order to have these material values, people must produce them, and in order to produce them, people must have the instruments of production with which food, clothing, footwear, shelter, fuel, etc. are produced. They must be able to produce these instruments and to use them. The instruments of production wherewith material values are produced, the people who operate the instruments of production and carry on the production of material values thanks to a certain production experience and labor skill. All these elements jointly constitute the productive forces of society. But the productive forces are only one aspect of production, only one aspect of the mode of production, an aspect that expresses the relation of men to the objects and forces of nature which they make use of for the production of material values. Another aspect of production, another aspect of the mode of production, is the relation of men to each other in the process of production, men's relations of production. Men carry on a struggle against nature and utilize nature for the production of material values not in isolation from each other, not as separate individuals, but in common, in groups, in societies. Production, therefore, is at all times and under all conditions social production. In the production of material values men enter into mutual relations of one kind or another within production, into relations of production of one kind or another. These may be relations of cooperation and mutual help between people who are free from exploitation. They may be relations of domination and subordination. And, lastly, they may be transitional from one form of relations of production to another. But whatever the character of the relations of production may be, always and in every system, they constitute just as essential an element of production as the productive forces of society. In production, Marx says, men not only act on nature but also on one another. They produce only by cooperating in a certain way and mutually exchanging their activities. In order to produce, they enter into definite connections and relations with one another, and only within these social connections and relations does their action on nature, does production, take place. Karl Marx, Selected Works. Volume I. p. 264. Consequently, production, the mode of production, embraces both the productive forces of society and men's relations of production, and is thus the embodiment of their unity in the process of production of material values. One of the features of production is that it never stays at one point for a long time and is always in a state of change and development, and that, furthermore, changes in the mode of production inevitably call forth changes in the whole social system, social ideas, political views and political institutions. They call forth a reconstruction of the whole social and political order. At different stages of development people make use of different modes of production, or, to put it more crudely, lead different manners of life. In the primitive commune there is one mode of production, under slavery there is another mode of production, under feudalism a third mode of production, and so on. And, correspondingly, men's social system, the spiritual life of men, their views and political institutions also vary. Whatever is the mode of production of a society, such in the main is the society itself, its ideas and theories, its political views and institutions. Or, to put it more crudely, whatever is man's manner of life, such is his manner of thought. This means that the history of development of society is above all the history of the development of production, the history of the modes of production which succeed each other in the course of centuries, the history of the development of productive forces and people's relations of production. Hence the history of social development is at the same time the history of the producers of material values themselves, the history of the laboring masses who are the chief force in the process of production and who carry on the production of material values necessary for the existence of society. Hence, if historical science is to be a real science, it can no longer reduce the history of social development to the actions of kings and generals, to the actions of conquerors and subjugators of states, but must above all devote itself to the history of the producers of material values, the history of the laboring masses, the history of peoples. Hence the clue to the study of the laws of history of society must not be sought in men's minds, in the views and ideas of society, but in the mode of production practiced by society in any given historical period. It must be sought in the economic life of society. Hence the prime task of historical science is to study and disclose the laws of production, the laws of development of the productive forces and of the relations of production, the laws of economic development of society. Hence, if the party of the proletariat is to be a real party, it must above all acquire a knowledge of the laws of development of production, of the laws of economic development of society. Hence, if it is not to err in policy, the party of the proletariat must both in drafting its program and in its practical activities proceed primarily from the laws of development of production, from the laws of economic development of society. A second feature of production is that its changes and development always begin with changes and development of the productive forces, and, in the first place, with changes and development of the instruments of production. Productive forces are therefore the most mobile and revolutionary element of production. Conformity with them, men's relations of production, their economic relations, change. This, however, does not mean that the relations of production do not influence the development of the productive forces and that the latter are not dependent on the former. While their development is dependent on the development of the productive forces, the relations of production in their turn react upon the development of the productive forces, accelerating or retarding it. In this connection, it should be noted that the relations of production cannot for too long a time lag behind and be in a state of contradiction to the growth of the productive forces, inasmuch as the productive forces can develop in full measure only when the relations of production correspond to the character, the state of the productive forces and allow full scope for their development. Therefore, however much the relations of production may lag behind the development of the productive forces, they must, sooner or later, come into correspondence with, and actually do come into correspondence with, the level of development of the productive forces, the character of the productive forces. Otherwise we would have a fundamental violation of the unity of the productive forces and the relations of production within the system of production, a disruption of production as a whole, a crisis of production, a destruction of productive forces. An instance in which the relations of production do not correspond to the character of the productive forces, conflict with them, is the economic crises in capitalist countries, where private capitalist ownership of the means of production is in glaring incongruity with the social character of the process of production, with the character of the productive forces. This results in economic crises, which lead to the destruction of productive forces. Furthermore, this incongruity itself constitutes the economic basis of social revolution, the purpose of which is to destroy the existing relations of production and to create new relations of production corresponding to the character of the productive forces. In contrast, an instance in which the relations of production completely correspond to the character of the productive forces is the socialist national economy of the USSR, where the social ownership of the means of production fully corresponds to the social character of the process of production, and where, because of this, economic crises and the destruction of productive forces are unknown. Consequently, the productive forces are not only the most mobile and revolutionary element in production, but are also the determining element in the development of production. Whatever are the productive forces, such must be the relations of production. While the state of the productive forces furnishes an answer to the question, with what instruments of production do men produce the material values they need? The state of the relations of production furnishes the answer to another question: who owns the means of production, the land, forests, waters, mineral resources, raw materials, instruments of production, production premises, means of transportation and communication, etc.? Who commands the means of production, whether the whole of society, or individual persons, groups, or classes which utilize them for the exploitation of other persons, groups or classes? Here is a rough picture of the development of productive forces from ancient times to our day. The transition from crude stone tools to the bow and arrow, and the accompanying transition from the life of hunters to the domestication of animals and primitive pasturage, the transition from stone tools to metal tools, the iron axe, the wooden plow fitted ith an iron coulter, etc., with a corresponding transition to tillage and agriculture, a further improvement in metal tools for the working up of materials, the introduction of the blacksmith's bellows, the introduction of pottery, with a corresponding development of handicrafts, the separation of handicrafts from agriculture, the development of an independent handicraft industry and, subsequently, of manufacture, the transition from handicraft tools to machines and the transformation of handicraft and manufacture into machine industry, the transition to the machine system and the rise of modern large-scale machine industry, such as a general and far from complete picture of the development of the productive forces of society in the course of man's history. It will be clear that the development and improvement of the instruments of production were effected by men who were related to production, and not independently of men. And, consequently, the change and development of the instruments of production were accompanied by a change and development of men, as the most important element of the productive forces, by a change and development of their production experience, their labor skill, their ability to handle the instruments of production. In conformity with the change and development of the productive forces of society in the course of history, men's relations of production, their economic relations also changed and developed. 5 main types of relations of production are known to history: primitive communal, slave, feudal, capitalist and socialist. The basis of the relations of production under the primitive communal system is that the means of production are socially owned. This in the main corresponds to the character of the productive forces of that period. Stone tools, and, later, the bow and arrow, precluded the possibility of men individually combating the forces of nature and beasts of prey. In order to gather the fruits of the forest, to catch fish, to build some sort of habitation, men were obliged to work in common if they did not want to die of starvation, or fall victim to beasts of prey or to neighboring societies. Labor in common led to the common ownership of the means of production, as well as of the fruits of production. Here the conception of private ownership of the means of production did not yet exist, except for the personal ownership of certain implements of production which were at the same time means of defense against beasts of prey. Here there was no exploitation, no classes. The basis of the relations of production under the slave system is that the slave owner owns the means of production. He also owns the worker in production, the slave, whom he can sell, purchase, or kill as though he were an animal. Such relations of production in the main correspond to the state of the productive forces of that period. Instead of stone tools, men now have metal tools at their command. Instead of the wretched and primitive husbandry of the hunter, who knew neither pasturage nor tillage, there now appear pasturage, tillage, handicrafts, and a division of labor between these branches of production. There appears the possibility of the exchange of products between individuals and between societies, of the accumulation of wealth in the hands of a few, the actual accumulation of the means of production in the hands of a minority, and the possibility of subjugation of the majority by a minority and their conversion into slaves. Here we no longer find the common and free labor of all members of society in the production process. Here there prevails the forced labor of slaves, who are exploited by the non-laboring slave owners. Here, therefore, there is no common ownership of the means of production or of the fruits of production. It is replaced by private ownership. Here the slave owner appears as the prime and principal property owner in the full sense of the term. Rich and poor, exploiters and exploited, people with full rights and people with no rights, and a fierce class struggle between them. Such is the picture of the slave system. The basis of the relations of production under the feudal system is that the feudal lord owns the means of production and does not fully own the worker in production, the serf, whom the feudal lord can no longer kill, but whom he can buy and sell. Alongside of feudal ownership there exists individual ownership by the peasant and the handicraftsman of his implements of production and his private enterprise based on his personal labor. Such relations of production in the main correspond to the state of the productive forces of that period. Further improvements in the smelting and working of iron, the spread of the iron plow and the loom, the further development of agriculture, horticulture, viniculture and dairying, the appearance of manufactories alongside of the handicraft workshops. Such are the characteristic features of the state of the productive forces. The new productive forces demand that the laborer shall display some kind of initiative in production and an inclination for work, an interest in work. The feudal lord therefore discards the slave, as a laborer who has no interest in work and is entirely without initiative, and prefers to deal with the serf, who has his own husbandry, implements of production, and a certain interest in work essential for the cultivation of the land and for the payment in kind of a part of his harvest to the feudal lord. Here private ownership is further developed. Exploitation is nearly as severe as it was under slavery, it is only slightly mitigated. A class struggle between exploiters and exploited is the principal feature of the feudal system. The basis of the relations of production under the capitalist system is that the capitalist owns the means of production, but not the workers in production, the wage laborers, whom the capitalist can neither kill nor sell because they are personally free, but who are deprived of means of production and, in order not to die of hunger, are obliged to sell their labor power to the capitalist and to bear the yoke of exploitation. Alongside of capitalist property in the means of production, we find, at first on a wide scale, private property of the peasants and handicraftsmen in the means of production, these peasants and handicraftsmen no longer being serfs, and their private property being based on personal labor. In place of the handicraft workshops and manufactories there appear huge mills and factories equipped with machinery. In place of the manorial estates tilled by the primitive implements of production of the peasant, there now appear large capitalist farms run on scientific lines and supplied with agricultural machinery. The new productive forces require that the workers in production shall be better educated and more intelligent than the downtrodden and ignorant serfs, that they be able to understand machinery and operate it properly. Therefore, the capitalists prefer to deal with wage workers who are free from the bonds of serfdom and who are educated enough to be able properly to operate machinery. But having developed productive forces to a tremendous extent, capitalism has become enmeshed in contradictions which it is unable to solve. By producing larger and larger quantities of commodities, and reducing their prices, capitalism intensifies competition, ruins the mass of small and medium private owners, converts them into proletarians and reduces their purchasing power, with the result that it becomes impossible to dispose of the commodities produced. On the other hand, by expanding production and concentrating millions of workers in huge mills and factories, capitalism lends the process of production a social character and thus undermines its own foundation, inasmuch as the social character of the process of production demands the social ownership of the means of production. Yet the means of production remain private capitalist property, which is incompatible with the social character of the process of production. These irreconcilable contradictions between the character of the productive forces and the relations of production make themselves felt in periodical crises of overproduction, when the capitalists, finding no effective demand for their goods owing to the ruin of the mass of the population which they themselves have brought about, are compelled to burn products, destroy manufactured goods, suspend production, and destroy productive forces at a time when millions of people are forced to suffer unemployment and starvation, not because there are not enough goods, but because there is an overproduction of goods. This means that the capitalist relations of production have ceased to correspond to the state of productive forces of society and have come into irreconcilable contradiction with them. This means that capitalism is pregnant with revolution, whose mission it is to replace the existing capitalist ownership of the means of production by socialist ownership. This means that the main feature of the capitalist system is a most acute class struggle between the exploiters and the exploited. The basis of the relations of production under the socialist system, which so far has been established only in the USSR, is the social ownership of the means of production. Here there are no longer exploiters and exploited. The goods produced are distributed according to labor performed, on the principle, he who does not work, neither shall he eat. Here the mutual relations of people in the process of production are marked by comradely cooperation and the socialist mutual assistance of workers who are free from exploitation. Here the relations of production fully correspond to the state of productive forces, for the social character of the process of production is reinforced by the social ownership of the means of production. For this reason socialist production in the USSR knows no periodical crises of overproduction and their accompanying absurdities. For this reason, the productive forces here develop at an accelerated pace, for the relations of production that correspond to them offer full scope for such development. Such is the picture of the development of men's relations of production in the course of human history. Such is the dependence of the development of the relations of production on the development of the production forces of society, and primarily, on the development of the instruments of production, the dependence by virtue of which the changes and development of the productive forces sooner or later lead to corresponding changes and development of the relations of production. The use and fabrication of instruments of labor, says Marx, although existing in the germ among certain species of animals, is specifically characteristic of the human labor process, and Franklin therefore defines man as a tool-making animal. Relics of bygone instruments of labor possess the same importance for the investigation of extinct economic forms of society, as do fossil bones for the determination of extinct species of animals. It is not the articles made, but how they are made, and by what instruments that enables us to distinguish different economic epochs. Instruments of labor not only supply a standard of the degree of development to which human labor has attained, but they are also indicators of the social conditions under which that labor is carried on. Karl Marx, Capital, Volume I, p. 159. And further, social relations are closely bound up with productive forces. In acquiring new productive forces men change their mode of production, and in changing their mode of production, in changing the way of earning their living, they change all their social conditions. The hand mill gives you society with the feudal lord, the steam mill, society with the industrial capitalist. Karl Marx, The Poverty of Philosophy, page 92. b. There is a continual movement of growth in productive forces, of destruction in social relations, of formation in ideas. The only immutable thing is the abstraction of movement. Ibid. Page 93. Speaking of historical materialism as formulated in the Communist Manifesto, Engels says, economic production and the structure of society of every historical epoch necessarily arising therefrom constitute the foundation for by instruments of labor. Marx has in mind primarily instruments of production, ed. From Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution. The political and intellectual history of that epoch. Consequently, ever since the dissolution of the primeval communal ownership of land, all history has been a history of class struggles, of struggles between exploited and exploiting, between dominated and dominating classes at various stages of social evolution. This struggle, however, has now reached a stage where the exploited and oppressed class, the proletariat, can no longer emancipate itself from the class which exploits and oppresses it, the bourgeoisie, without at the same time forever freeing the whole of society from exploitation, oppression and class struggles. Preface to the German edition of the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx, Selected Works, Volume I, pp. I 92-93. A third feature of production is that the rise of new productive forces and of the relations of production corresponding to them does not take place separately from the old system, after the disappearance of the old system, but within the old system. It takes place not as a result of the deliberate and conscious activity of man, but spontaneously, unconsciously, independently of the will of man. It takes place spontaneously and independently of the will of man for two reasons. First, because men are not free to choose one mode of production or another, because as every new generation enters life it finds productive forces and relations of production already existing as the result of the work of former generations, owing to which it is obliged at first to accept and adapt itself to everything it finds ready-made in the sphere of production in order to be able to produce material values. Secondly, because, when improving one instrument of production or another, one element of the productive forces or another, men do not realize, do not understand or stop to reflect what social results these improvements will lead to, but only think of their everyday interests, of lightening their labor and of securing some direct and tangible advantage for themselves. When, gradually and gropingly, certain members of primitive communal society passed from the use of stone tools to the use of iron tools, they, of course, did not know and did not stop to reflect what social results this innovation would lead to. They did not understand or realize that the change to metal tools meant a revolution in production, that it would in the long run lead to the slave system. They simply wanted to lighten their labor and secure an immediate and tangible advantage. Their conscious activity was confined within the narrow bounds of this everyday personal interest. When, in the period of the feudal system, the young bourgeoisie of Europe began to erect, alongside of the small guild workshops, large manufactories, and thus advanced the productive forces of society. It, of course, did not know and did not stop to reflect what social consequences this innovation would lead to. It did not realize or understand that this, small, innovation would lead to a regrouping of social forces which was to end in a revolution both against the power of kings, whose favors it so highly valued, and against the nobility, to whose ranks its foremost representatives not infrequently aspired. It simply wanted to lower the cost of producing goods, to throw large quantities of goods on the markets of Asia and of recently discovered America, and to make bigger profits. Its conscious activity was confined within the narrow bounds of this commonplace practical aim. When the Russian capitalists, in conjunction with foreign capitalists, energetically implanted modern large-scale machine industry in Russia, while leaving TSRdom intact and turning the peasants over to the tender mercies of the landlords, they, of course, did not know and did not stop to reflect what social consequences this extensive growth of productive forces would lead to. They did not realize or understand that this big leap in the realm of the productive forces of society would lead to a regrouping of social forces that would enable the proletariat to effect a union with the peasantry and to bring about a victorious socialist revolution. They simply wanted to expand industrial production to the limit, to gain control of the huge home market, to become monopolists, and to squeeze as much profit as possible out of the national economy. Their conscious activity did not extend beyond their commonplace, strictly practical interests. Accordingly, Marx says, in the social production which men carry on, that is, in the production of the material values necessary to the life of men, ed. They enter into definite relations that are indispensable and independent of their will. These relations of production correspond to a definite stage of development of their material forces of production. Karl Marx, Selected Works, Volume 1, page 356. This, however, does not mean that changes in the relations of production, and the transition from old relations of production to new relations of production proceed smoothly, without conflicts, without upheavals. On the contrary, such a transition usually takes place by means of the revolutionary overthrow of the old relations of production and the establishment of new relations of production. Up to a certain period the development of the productive forces and the changes in the realm of asterisk are italics, ed. The relations of production proceed spontaneously, independently of the will of men. But that is so only up to a certain moment, until the new and developing productive forces have reached a proper state of maturity. After the new productive forces have matured, the existing relations of production and their upholders, the ruling classes, become that insuperable obstacle which can only be removed by the conscious action of the new classes, by the forcible acts of these classes, by revolution. Here there stands out in bold relief the tremendous role of new social ideas, of new political institutions, of a new political power, whose mission it is to abolish by force the old relations of production. Out of the conflict between the new productive forces and the old relations of production, out of the new economic demands of society there arise new social ideas. The new ideas organize and mobilize the masses. The masses become welded into a new political army, create a new revolutionary power, and make use of it to abolish by force the old system of relations of production, and firmly to establish the new system. The spontaneous process of development yields place to the conscious actions of men, peaceful development to violent upheaval, evolution to revolution. The proletariat, says Marx, during its contest with the bourgeoisie is compelled, by the force of circumstances, to organize itself as a class. By means of a revolution, it makes itself the ruling class, and, as such, sweeps away by force the old conditions of production. The Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx, Selected Works, Volume I, page 228. And further, a. The proletariat will use its political supremacy to wrest, by degrees, all capital from the bourgeoisie, to centralize all instruments of production in the hands of the state, i.e., of the proletariat organized as the ruling class, and to increase the total of productive forces as rapidly as possible. Ibid. Page 227. B. Force is the midwife of every old society pregnant with a new one. Karl Marx, Capital, Volume I, page 776. Here is the brilliant formulation of the essence of historical materialism given by Marx in 1859 in his historic preface to his famous book, Critique of Political Economy. In the social production which men carry on they enter into definite relations that are indispensable and independent of their will. These relations of production correspond to a definite stage of development of their material forces of production. The sum total of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society. The real foundation, on which rises a legal and political superstructure and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production in material life determines the social, political and intellectual life process in general. It is not the consciousness of men that determines their being, but, on the contrary, their social being that determines their consciousness. At a certain stage of their development, the material forces of production in society come in conflict with the existing relations of production, or, what is but a legal expression for the same thing, with the property relations within which they have been at work before. From forms of development of the forces of production, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an epoch of social revolution. With the change of the economic foundation, the entire immense superstructure is more or less rapidly transformed. In considering such transformations, a distinction should always be made between the material transformation of the economic conditions of production, which can be determined with the precision of natural science, and the legal, political, religious, aesthetic or philosophic, in short, ideological forms in which men become conscious of this conflict and fight it out. Just as our opinion of an individual is not based on what he thinks of himself, so can we not judge of such a period of transformation by its own consciousness. On the contrary, this consciousness must be explained rather from the contradictions of material life, from the existing conflict between the social forces of production and the relations of production. No social order ever disappears before all the productive forces for which there is room in it have been developed, and new higher relations of production never appear before the material conditions of their existence have matured in the womb of the old society itself. Therefore, mankind always sets itself only such tasks as it can solve, since, looking at the matter more closely, we will always find that the task itself arises only when the material conditions necessary for its solution already exists or are at least in the process of formation. Karl Marx. Selected Works, Volume 1, pp. 356-57. Such is Marxist materialism as applied to social life, to the history of society. Such are the principal features of dialectical and historical materialism. It will be seen from this what a theoretical treasure was safeguarded by Lenin for the party and protected from the attacks of the revisionists and renegades, and how important was the appearance of Lenin's book, Materialism and Empirio-Criticism, for the development of our party. 3. Bolsheviks and Mensheviks in the period of the Stolypin reaction, struggle of the Bolsheviks against the liquidators and OTZOVISTS. During the years of reaction, the work in the party organizations was far more difficult than during the preceding period of development of the revolution. The party membership had sharply declined. Many of the petty bourgeois fellow travelers of the party, especially the intellectuals, deserted its ranks from fear of persecution by the Tsarist government. Lenin pointed out that at such moments revolutionary parties should perfect their knowledge. During the period of rise of the revolution they learned how to advance. During the period of reaction they should learn how to retreat properly, how to go underground, how to preserve and strengthen the illegal party, how to make use of legal opportunities, of all illegally existing, especially mass, organizations in order to strengthen their connections with the masses. The Mensheviks retreated in panic, not believing that a new rise in the tide of revolution was possible. They disgracefully renounced the revolutionary demands of the program and the revolutionary slogans of the party. They wanted to liquidate, to abolish, the revolutionary illegal party of the proletariat. For this reason, Mensheviks of this type came to be known as liquidators. Unlike the Mensheviks, the Bolsheviks were certain that within the next few years there would be a rise in the tide of revolution, and held that it was the duty of the party to prepare the masses for this new rise. The fundamental problems of the revolution had not been solved. The peasants had not obtained the landlord's land, the workers had not obtained the 8-hour day, the Tsarist autocracy, so detested by the people, had not been overthrown, and it had again suppressed the meager political liberties which the people had wrung from it in 1905. Thus, the causes which had given rise to the revolution of 1905 still remained in force. That is why the Bolsheviks were certain that there would be a new rise of the revolutionary movement, prepared for it and mustered the forces of the working class. The Bolsheviks derived their certainty that a new rise in the tide of the revolution was inevitable also from the fact that the revolution of 1905 had taught the working class to fight for its rights in mass revolutionary struggle. During the period of reaction, when the capitalists took the offensive, the workers could not forget these lessons of 1905. Lenin quoted letters from workers in which they told how factory owners were again oppressing and humiliating them, and in which they said, "Wait, another I-905 will come." The fundamental political aim of the Bolsheviks remained what it had been in 1905, namely, to overthrow TSRdom, to carry the bourgeois democratic revolution to its conclusion and to proceed to the socialist revolution. Never for a moment did the Bolsheviks forget this aim, and they continued to put before the masses the principal revolutionary slogans, a democratic republic, the confiscation of the landed estates, and an 8-hour day. But the tactics of the party could not remain what they had been during the rising tide of the revolution in 1905. For example, it would have been wrong in the immediate future to call the masses to a general political strike or to an armed uprising, for the revolutionary movement was on the decline, the working class was in a state of extreme fatigue, and the position of the reactionary classes had been strengthened considerably. The party had to reckon with the new situation. Offensive tactics had to be replaced by defensive tactics, the tactics of mustering forces, the tactics of withdrawing the cadres underground and of carrying on the work of the party from underground, the tactics of combining illegal work with work in the legal working class organizations. And the Bolsheviks proved able to accomplish this. We knew how to work during the long years preceding the revolution. Not for nothing do they say that we are as firm as a rock. The Social Democrats have formed a proletarian party which will not lose heart at the failure of the first armed onslaught, will not lose its head, and will not be carried away by adventures, wrote Lenin. Lenin, Collected Works, Rus. ed. Volume 12, page 126. The Bolsheviks strove to preserve and strengthen the illegal party organizations. But at the same time they deemed it essential to utilize every legal opportunity, every legal opening to maintain and preserve connections with the masses and thus strengthen the party. This was a period when our party turned from the open revolutionary struggle against TSRDM to roundabout methods of struggle, to the utilization of each and every legal opportunity, from mutual aid societies to the Duma platform. This was a period of retreat after we had been defeated in the revolution of 1905. This turn made it incumbent upon us to master new methods of struggle, in order to muster our forces and resume the open revolutionary struggle against TSRDM. J. Stalin, verbatim report of the 15th Party Congress, Rus. ed. pp. 366-67, 1935. The surviving legal organizations served as a sort of screen for the underground organizations of the party and as a means of maintaining connections with the masses. In order to preserve their connections with the masses, the Bolsheviks made use of the trade unions and other legally existing public organizations, such as sick benefit societies, workers' cooperative societies, clubs, educational societies and people's houses. The Bolsheviks made use of the platform of the State Duma to expose the policy of the Tsarist government, to expose the constitutional Democrats, and to win the support of the peasants for the proletariat. The preservation of the illegal party organization, and the direction of all other forms of political work through this organization, enabled the party to pursue a correct line and to muster forces in preparation for a new rise in the tide of revolution. The Bolsheviks carried out their revolutionary line in a fight on two fronts, a fight against the two varieties of opportunism within the party, against the liquidators, who were open adversaries of the party, and against what were known as the Otzavists, who were concealed foes of the party. The Bolsheviks, headed by Lenin, waged a relentless struggle against liquidationism from the very inception of this opportunist trend. Lenin pointed out that the liquidators were agents of the liberal bourgeoisie within the party. In December 1908, the Fifth, All-Russian, Conference of the RSDLP was held in Paris. On Lenin's motion, this conference condemned liquidationism, that is, the attempts of a certain section of the party intellectuals, Mensheviks, to liquidate the existing organization of the RSDLP and to replace it at all costs, even at the price of downright renunciation of the program, tactics and traditions of the party, by an amorphous association functioning legally. CPSU, B, in Resolutions. Rus. ed. Part 1, page 128. The conference called upon all party organizations to wage a resolute struggle against the attempts of the liquidators. But the Mensheviks did not abide by this decision of the conference and increasingly committed themselves to liquidationism, betrayal of the revolution, and collaboration with the constitutional Democrats. The Mensheviks were more and more openly renouncing the revolutionary program of the Proletarian Party, the demands for a democratic republic, for an 8-hour day and for the confiscation of the landed estates. They wanted, at the price of renouncing the program and tactics of the party, to obtain the consent of the Tsarist government to the existence of an open, legal, supposedly, labor, party. They were prepared to make peace with and to adapt themselves to the Stolypin regime. That is why the liquidators were also called the Stolypin Labor Party. Besides fighting the overt adversaries of the revolution, the liquidators, who were headed by Dan, Axelrod, and Petrasov, and assisted by Martov, Trotsky and other Mensheviks, the Bolsheviks also waged a relentless struggle against the covert liquidators, the Otzavists, who camouflaged their opportunism by left phraseology. Otzavists was the name given to certain former Bolsheviks who demanded the recall, Otsav means recall, of the workers' deputies from the State Duma and the discontinuation of work in legally existing organizations altogether. In 1908 a number of Bolsheviks demanded the recall of the Social Democratic deputies from the State Duma. Hence, they were called Otzavists. The Otzavists formed their own group, Bogdanov, Lunacharsky, Alexansky, Pokrovsky, Bubnov and others, which started a struggle against Lenin and Lenin's line. The Otzavists stubbornly refused to work in the trade unions and other legally existing societies. In doing so they did great injury to the workers' cause. The Otzavists were driving a wedge between the party and the working class, tending to deprive the party of its connections with the non-party masses. They wanted to seclude themselves within the underground organization, yet at the same time they placed it in jeopardy by denying it the opportunity of utilizing legal cover. The Otzavists did not understand that in the State Duma and through the State Duma, the Bolsheviks could influence the peasantry, could expose the policy of the Tsarist government and the policy of the constitutional Democrats, who were trying to gain the following of the peasantry by fraud. The Otzavists hampered the mustering of forces for a new advance of the revolution. The Otzavists were therefore liquidators inside out. They endeavored to destroy the possibility of utilizing the legally existing organizations and, in fact, renounced proletarian leadership of the broad non-party masses, renounced revolutionary work. A conference of the enlarged editorial board of the Bolshevik newspaper Proletary, summoned in 1909 to discuss the conduct of the Otzevists, condemned them. The Bolsheviks announced that they had nothing in common with the Otzevists and expelled them from the Bolshevik organization. Both the liquidators and the Otzevists were nothing but petty bourgeois fellow travelers of the proletariat and its party. When times were hard for the proletariat, the true character of the liquidators in Otzevists became revealed with particular clarity. 4. Struggle of the Bolsheviks against Trotskyism. Anti-Party August Block. At a time when the Bolsheviks were waging a relentless struggle on two fronts, against the liquidators and against the Otzevists, defending the consistent line of the proletarian party, Trotsky supported the Menshevik liquidators. It was at this period that Lenin branded him Judas Trotsky. Trotsky formed a group of writers in Vienna, Austria, and began to publish an allegedly non-factional, but in reality Menshevik newspaper. Trotsky behaves like a most despicable careerist and factionalist. He pays lip service to the party, but behaves worse than any other factionalist, wrote Lenin at the time. Later, in 1912, Trotsky organized the August Bloc, a bloc of all the anti-Bolshevik groups and trends directed against Lenin and the Bolshevik Party. The liquidators and the Otzevists united in this anti-Bolshevik bloc, thus demonstrating their kinship. Trotsky and the Trotskyites took up a liquidationist stand on all fundamental issues. But Trotsky masked his liquidationism under the guise of centrism, that is, conciliationism. He claimed that he belonged to neither the Bolsheviks nor the Mensheviks and that he was trying to reconcile them. In this connection, Lenin said that Trotsky was more vile and pernicious than the open liquidators, because he was trying to deceive the workers into believing that he was above factions, whereas in fact he entirely supported the Menshevik liquidators. The Trotskyites were the principal group that fostered centrism. Centrism, writes Comrade Stalin, is a political concept. Its ideology is one of adaptation, of subordination of the interests of the proletariat to the interests of the petty bourgeoisie within one common party. This ideology is alien and abhorrent to Leninism. Stalin. Leninism, Volume 2. The Industrialization of the Country and the Right Deviation in the CPSU, page 97. At this period Kamenev, Zinoviev and Rykov were actually covert agents of Trotsky, for they often helped him against Lenin. With the aid of Zinoviev, Kamenev, Rykov and other covert allies of Trotsky, a plenum of the Central Committee was convened in January 1910 against Lenin's wishes. By that time the composition of the Central Committee had changed owing to the arrest of a number of Bolsheviks, and the vacillating elements were able to force through anti-Leninist decisions. Thus, it was decided at this plenum to close down the Bolshevik newspaper Proletary and to give financial support to Trotsky's newspaper Pravda, published in Vienna. Kamenev joined the editorial board of Trotsky's newspaper and together with Zinoviev strove to make it the organ of the Central Committee. It was only on Lenin's insistence that the January plenum of the Central Committee adopted a resolution condemning liquidationism and Otzevism, but here too Zinoviev and Kamenev insisted on Trotsky's proposal that the liquidators should not be referred to as such. It turned out as Lenin had foreseen and forewarned. Only the Bolsheviks obeyed the decision of the plenum of the Central Committee and closed down their organ, Proletary, whereas the Mensheviks continued to publish their financial liquidationist newspaper Golos Social Democrat, Voice of the Social Democrat. Lenin's position was fully supported by Comrade Stalin, who published a special article in Social Democrat, number 11, in which he condemned the conduct of the accomplices of Trotskyism, and spoke of the necessity of putting an end to the abnormal situation created within the Bolshevik group by the treacherous conduct of Kamenev, Zinoviev and Rykov. The article advanced as immediate tasks what was later carried into effect at the Prague Party Conference, namely, convocation of a general party conference, publication of a party newspaper appearing legally, and creation of an illegal practical party center in Russia. Comrade Stalin's article was based on decisions of the Baku Committee, which fully supported Lenin. To counteract Trotsky's anti-party August Bloc, which consisted exclusively of anti-party elements, from the liquidators and Trotskyites to the Otzevists and God-builders, a party bloc was formed consisting of people who wanted to preserve and strengthen the illegal proletarian party. This bloc consisted of the Bolsheviks, headed by Lenin, and a small number of pro-party Mensheviks, headed by Plekhanov. Plekhanov and his group of pro-party Mensheviks, while maintaining the Menshevik position on a number of questions, emphatically dissociated themselves from the August Bloc and the liquidators and sought to reach agreement with the Bolsheviks. Lenin accepted Plekhanov's proposal and consented to a temporary bloc with him against the anti-party elements on the ground that such a bloc would be advantageous to the party and fatal to the liquidators. Comrade Stalin fully supported this bloc. He was in exile at the time and from there wrote a letter to Lenin, saying, "Ests of the work in Russia, which demands that all party elements should rally together. To this line, and it alone, will expedite the process of emancipation of the legal organizations from the yoke of the liquidators, by digging a gulf between the mech workers and the liquidators, and dispersing and disposing of the latter. Lenin and Stalin. Russ. ed. Volume I, pp. 529-30. Thanks to a skillful combination of illegal and legal work, the Bolsheviks were able to become a serious force in the legal workers' organizations. This was revealed, incidentally, in the great influence which the Bolsheviks exercised on the workers' groups at 4 legally held congresses that took place at that period: a Congress of People's Universities, a Women's Congress, a Congress of Factory Physicians, and a Temperance Congress. The speeches of the Bolsheviks at these congresses were of great political value and awakened a response all over the country. For example, at the Congress of People's Universities, the Bolshevik workers' delegation exposed the policy of TSK which stifled all cultural activity, and contended that no real cultural progress in the country was conceivable unless TSK were abolished. The workers' delegation at the Congress of Factory Physicians told of the frightfully unsanitary conditions in which the workers had to live and work, and drew the conclusion that factory hygiene could not be properly ensured until TSK was overthrown. The Bolsheviks gradually squeezed the liquidators out of the various legal organizations that still survived. The peculiar tactics of a united front with the Plekhanov pro-party group enabled the Bolsheviks to win over a number of Menshevik worker organizations, in the Vyborg district, Ekaterinoslav, etc. In this difficult period the Bolsheviks set an example of how legal work should be combined with illegal work. 5. Prague Party Conference, I9-I2. Bolsheviks constitute themselves an independent Marxist party. The fight against the liquidators and Otzevists, as well as against the Trotskyites, confronted the Bolsheviks with the urgent necessity of uniting all the Bolsheviks and forming them into an independent Bolshevik party. This was absolutely essential not only in order to put an end to the opportunist trends within the party which were splitting the work mech, an abbreviation for Menshevik, ed. ing class, but also in order to complete the work of mustering the forces of the working class and preparing it for a new upward swing of the revolution. But before this task could be accomplished the party had to be rid of opportunists, of Mensheviks. No Bolshevik now doubted that it was unthinkable for the Bolsheviks to remain in one party with the Mensheviks. The treacherous conduct of the Mensheviks in the period of the Stolypin reaction, their attempts to liquidate the proletarian party and to organize a new, reformist party, made a rupture with them inevitable. By remaining in one party with the Mensheviks, the Bolsheviks in one way or another accepted moral responsibility for the behavior of the Mensheviks. But for the Bolsheviks to accept moral responsibility for the open treachery of the Mensheviks was unthinkable, unless they themselves wanted to become traitors to the party and the working class. Unity with the Mensheviks within a single party was thus assuming the character of a betrayal of the working class and its party. Consequently, the actual rupture with the Mensheviks had to be carried to its conclusion, a formal organizational rupture and the expulsion of the Mensheviks from the party. Only in this way was it possible to restore the revolutionary party of the proletariat with a single program, single tactics, and a single class organization. Only in this way was it possible to restore the real, not just formal, unity of the party, which the Mensheviks had destroyed. This task was to be performed by the 6th General Party Conference, for which the Bolsheviks were making preparations. But this was only one aspect of the matter. A formal rupture with the Mensheviks and the formation by the Bolsheviks of a separate party was, of course, a very important political task. But the Bolsheviks were confronted with another and even more important task. The task of the Bolsheviks was not merely to break with the Mensheviks and formally constitute themselves a separate party, but above all, having broken with the Mensheviks, to create a new party, to create a party of a new type, different from the usual social democratic parties of the West, one that was free of opportunist elements and capable of leading the proletariat in a struggle for power. In fighting the Bolsheviks, the Mensheviks of all shades, from Axelrod and Martinov to Martov and Trotsky, invariably used weapons borrowed from the arsenal of the West European Social Democrats. They wanted in Russia a party similar, let us say, to the German or French Social Democratic Party. They fought the Bolsheviks just because they sensed something new in them, something unusual and different from the Social Democrats of the West. And what did the Social Democratic parties of the West represent at that time? A mixture, a hodgepodge of Marxist and opportunist elements, of friends and foes of the revolution, of supporters and opponents of the party principle, the former gradually becoming ideologically reconciled to the latter, and virtually subordinated to them. Conciliation with the opportunists, with the traitors to the revolution, for the sake of what? The Bolsheviks asked the West European Social Democrats. For the sake of peace within the party, for the sake of unity, the latter replied. Unity with whom? With the opportunists. Yes, they replied, with the opportunists. It was clear that such parties could not be revolutionary parties. The Bolsheviks could not help seeing that after Engels' death the West European social democratic parties had begun to degenerate from parties of social revolution into parties of social reforms, and that each of these parties, as an organization, had already been converted from a leading force into an appendage of its own parliamentary group. The Bolsheviks could not help knowing that such a party boded no good to the proletariat, that such a party was not capable of leading the working class to revolution. The Bolsheviks could not help knowing that the proletariat needed, not such a party, but a different kind of party, a new and genuinely Marxist party, which would be irreconcilable towards the opportunists and revolutionary towards the bourgeoisie, which would be firmly knit and monolithic, which would be a party of social revolution, a party of the dictatorship of the proletariat. It was this new kind of party that the Bolsheviks wanted. And the Bolsheviks worked to build up such a party. The whole history of the struggle against the economists, Mensheviks, Trotskyites, Otzevists and idealists of all shades, down to the empirio-criticists, was a history of the building up of just such a party. The Bolsheviks wanted to create a new party, a Bolshevist party, which would serve as a model for all who wanted to have a real revolutionary Marxist party. The Bolsheviks had been working to build up such a party ever since the time of the old Iskra. They worked for it stubbornly, persistently, in spite of everything. A fundamental and decisive part was played in this work by the writings of Lenin. What is to be done? Two tactics, etc. Lenin's what is to be done was the ideological preparation for such a party. Lenin's one step forward, two steps back was the organizational preparation for such a party. Cratic revolution was the political preparation for such a party. And, lastly, Lenin's materialism and empirio-criticism was the theoretical preparation for such a party. It may be safely said that never in history has any political group been so thoroughly prepared to constitute itself a party as the Bolshevik group was. The conditions were therefore fully ripe and ready for the Bolsheviks to constitute themselves a party. It was the task of the Sixth Party Conference to crown the completed work by expelling the Mensheviks and formally constituting the new party, the Bolshevik Party. The Sixth All-Russian Party Conference was held in Prague in January 1912. Over 20 party organizations were represented. The conference, therefore, had the significance of a regular party congress. In the statement of the conference, which announced that the shattered central apparatus of the party had been restored and a central committee set up, it was declared that the period of reaction had been the most difficult the Russian Social Democratic Party had experienced since it had taken shape as a definite organization. In spite of all persecution, in spite of the severe blows dealt it from without and the treachery and vacillation of the opportunists within, the party of the proletariat had preserved intact its banner and its organization. Not only have the banner of the Russian Social Democratic Party, its program and its revolutionary traditions survived, but so has its organization, which persecution may have undermined and weakened, but could never utterly destroy, the statement of the conference declared. The conference recorded the first symptoms of a new rise of the working class movement in Russia and a revival in party work. In its resolution on the reports presented by the local organizations, the conference noted that energetic work is being conducted everywhere among the social democratic workers with the object of strengthening the local illegal social democratic organizations and groups. The conference noted that the most important rule of Bolshevik tactics in periods of retreat, namely, to combine illegal work with legal work within the various legally existing workers' societies and unions, was being observed in all the localities. The Prague Conference elected a Bolshevik Central Committee of the party, consisting of Lenin, Stalin, Ordzhonikidze, Sverdlov, Spandarian, Golashekin and others. Comrades Stalin and Sverdlov were elected to the Central Committee in their absence, as they were in exile. At the time, among the elected alternate members of the Central Committee was Comrade Kalinin. For the direction of revolutionary work in Russia, a practical center, the Russian Bureau of the CC, was set up with Comrade Stalin at its head and including Comrades Y. Sverdlov, S. Spandarian, S. Ordzhonikidze, M. Kalinin and Golashekin. The Prague Conference reviewed the whole preceding struggle of the Bolsheviks against opportunism and decided to expel the Mensheviks from the party. By expelling the Mensheviks from the party, the Prague Conference formally inaugurated the independent existence of the Bolshevik Party. Having routed the Mensheviks ideologically and organizationally and expelled them from the party, the Bolsheviks preserved the old banner of the party, of the RSDLP. That is why the Bolshevik Party continued until 1918 to call itself the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, adding the word Bolsheviks in brackets. Writing to Gorky at the beginning of 1912, on the results of the Prague Conference, Lenin said, "At last we have succeeded, in spite of the liquidator scum, in restoring the party and its Central Committee. I hope you will rejoice with us over the fact." Lenin, Collected Works, Rus. ed. Volume 29, page 19. Speaking of the significance of the Prague Conference, Comrade Stalin said, "This conference was of the utmost importance in the history of our party, for it drew a boundary line between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks and amalgamated the Bolshevik organizations all over the country into a united Bolshevik party." Verbatim report of the 15th Congress of the CPSU, B. Russ, ed. pp. 361 to 362. After the expulsion of the Mensheviks and the constitution by the Bolsheviks of an independent party, the Bolshevik Party became firmer and stronger. The party strengthens itself by purging its ranks of opportunist elements. That is one of the maxims of the Bolshevik Party, which is a party of a new type fundamentally different from the social democratic parties of the Second International. Although the parties of the Second International called themselves Marxist parties, in reality they tolerated foes of Marxism, avowed opportunists, in their ranks and allowed them to corrupt and to ruin the Second International. From Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution, Bolsheviks, on the contrary, waged a relentless struggle against the opportunists, purged the proletarian party of the filth of opportunism and succeeded in creating a party of a new type, a Leninist party, the party which later achieved the dictatorship of the proletariat. If the opportunists had remained within the ranks of the proletarian party, the Bolshevik Party could not have come out on the broad highway and led the proletariat, it could not have taken power and set up the dictatorship of the proletariat, it could not have emerged victorious from the Civil War and built socialism. The Prague Conference decided to put forward as the chief immediate political slogans of the party the demands contained in the minimum program: a democratic republic, an 8-hour day, and the confiscation of the landed estates. It was under these revolutionary slogans that the Bolsheviks conducted their campaign in connection with the elections to the Fourth State Duma. It was these slogans that guided the new rise of the revolutionary movement of the working class masses in the years I9, I2, I4. BRIEFSUMMARY. The years I908, I2 were a most difficult period for revolutionary work. After the defeat of the revolution, when the revolutionary movement was on the decline and the masses were fatigued, the Bolsheviks changed their tactics and passed from the direct struggle against TSRDM to a roundabout struggle. In the difficult conditions that prevailed during the Stolypin reaction, the Bolsheviks made use of the slightest legal opportunity to maintain their connections with the masses, from sick benefit societies and trade unions to the Duma platform. The Bolsheviks indefatigably worked to muster forces for a new rise of the revolutionary movement. In the difficult conditions brought about by the defeat of the revolution, the disintegration of the oppositional trends, the disappointment with the revolution, and the increasing endeavors of intellectuals who had deserted the party, Bogdanov, Bazarov and others, to revise its theoretical foundations, the Bolsheviks were the only force in the party who did not furl the party banner, who remained faithful to the party program, and who beat off the attacks of the critics of Marxist theory, Lenin's materialism and imperio-criticism. What helped the leading core of the Bolsheviks, centered around Lenin, to safeguard the party and its revolutionary principles was that this core had been tempered by Marxist-Leninist ideology and had grasped the perspectives of the revolution. Not for nothing do they say that we are as firm as a rock. Lenin stated in referring to the Bolsheviks. The Mensheviks at that period were drawing farther and farther away from the revolution. They became liquidators, demanding the liquidation, abolition, of the illegal revolutionary party of the proletariat. They more and more openly renounced the party program and the revolutionary aims and slogans of the party, and endeavored to organize their own, reformist party, which the workers christened a Stolypin Labor Party. Trotsky supported the liquidators, pharisically using the slogan, Unity of the Party, as a screen, but actually meaning unity with the liquidators. On the other hand, some of the Bolsheviks, who did not understand the necessity for the adoption of new and roundabout ways of combating TSRDM, demanded that legal opportunities should not be utilized and that the workers' deputies in the State Duma be recalled. These Otzevists were driving the party towards a rupture with the masses and were hampering the mustering of forces for a new rise of the revolution. Using left phraseology as a screen, the Otzevists, like the liquidators, in essence renounced the revolutionary struggle. The liquidators and Otzevists united against Lenin in a common bloc, known as the August Bloc, organized by Trotsky. In the struggle against the liquidators and Otzevists, in the struggle against the August Bloc, the Bolsheviks gained the upper hand and succeeded in safeguarding the illegal proletarian party. The outstanding event of this period was the Prague Conference of the RSDLP, January 1912. At this conference the Mensheviks were expelled from the party, and the formal unity of the Bolsheviks with the Mensheviks within one party was ended forever. From a political group, the Bolsheviks formally constituted themselves an independent party, the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, Bolsheviks. The Prague Conference inaugurated a party of a new type, the party of Leninism, the Bolshevik Party. The purge of the ranks of the proletarian party of opportunists, Mensheviks, effected at the Prague Conference, had an important and decisive influence on the subsequent development of the party and the revolution. If the Bolsheviks had not expelled the betrayers of the workers' cause, the Menshevik compromisers, from the party, the proletarian party would have been unable in 1917 to rouse the masses for the fight for the dictatorship of the proletariat. CHAPTERFIVE. The Bolshevik Party during the new rise of the working class movement. Before the First Imperialist War, 1912-1914. 1. Rise of the revolutionary movement in the period 1912 to 14. The triumph of the Stolypin reaction was short-lived. A government which would offer the people nothing but the knout and the gallows could not endure. Repressive measures became so habitual that they ceased to inspire fear in the people. The fatigue felt by the workers in the years immediately following the defeat of the revolution began to wear off. The workers resumed the struggle. The Bolsheviks forecast that a new rise in the tide of revolution was inevitable proved correct. In 1911, the number of strikers already exceeded 100,000, whereas in each of the previous years it had been no more than 50,000 or 60,000. The Prague Party Conference, held in January 1912, could already register the beginnings of a revival of the working class movement. But the real rise in the revolutionary movement began in April and May 1912, when mass political strikes broke out in connection with the shooting down of workers in the Lena goldfields. On April 4, 1912, during a strike in the Lena goldfields in Siberia, over 500 workers were killed or wounded upon the orders of a Tsarist officer of the gendarmerie. The shooting down of an unarmed body of Lena miners who were peacefully proceeding to negotiate with the management stirred the whole country. This new bloody deed of the Tsarist autocracy was committed to break an economic strike of the miners and thus please the masters of the Lena goldfields, the British capitalists. The British capitalists and their Russian partners derived huge profits from the Lena goldfields, over 7 million rubles annually, by most shamelessly exploiting the workers. They paid the workers miserable wages and supplied them with rotten food unfit to eat. Unable to endure the oppression and humiliation any longer, 6,000 workers of the Lena goldfields went on strike. The proletariat of St. Petersburg, Moscow and all other industrial 145 centers and regions replied to the Lena shooting by mass strikes, demonstrations and meetings. We were so dazed and shocked that we could not at once find words to express our feelings. Whatever protest we made would be but a pale reflection of the anger that seethed in the hearts of all of us. Nothing can help us, neither tears nor protests, but an organized mass struggle, the workers of one group of factories declared in their resolution. The furious indignation of the workers was further aggravated when the Tsarist minister Makarov, who was interpellated by the Social Democratic group in the State Duma on the subject of the Lena massacre, insolently declared, "So it was, so it will be." The number of participants in the political protest strikes against the bloody massacre of the Lena workers rose to 300,000. The Lena events were like a hurricane which rent the atmosphere of peace created by the Stolypin regime. This is what Comrade Stalin wrote in this connection in 1912 in the St. Petersburg Bolshevik newspaper, Zvezda, Star. The Lena shooting has broken the ice of silence and the river of the people's movement has begun to flow. The ice is broken. All that was evil and pernicious in the present regime, all the ills of much suffering Russia were focused in the one fact, the Lena events. That is why it was the Lena shooting that served as a signal for the strikes and demonstrations. The efforts of the liquidators and Trotskyites to bury the revolution had been in vain. The Lena events showed that the forces of revolution were alive, that a tremendous store of revolutionary energy had accumulated in the working class. The May Day strikes of 1912 involved about 400,000 workers. These strikes bore a marked political character and were held under the Bolshevik revolutionary slogans of a democratic republic, an 8-hour day, and the confiscation of the landed estates. These main slogans were designed to unite not only the broad masses of the workers, but also the peasants and soldiers for a revolutionary onslaught on the autocracy. The huge May Day strike of the proletariat of all Russia and the accompanying street demonstrations, revolutionary proclamations, and revolutionary speeches to gatherings of workers have clearly shown that Russia has entered the phase of a rise in the revolution, wrote Lenin in an article entitled, The Revolutionary Rise. Lenin, Collected Works, Rus. ed. Volume 15, page 533. Alarmed by the revolutionary spirit of the workers, the liquidators came out against the strike movement. They called it a strike fever. The liquidators and their ally, Trotsky, wanted to substitute for the revolutionary struggle of the proletariat a petition campaign. They invited the workers to sign a petition, a scrap of paper, requesting the granting of rights, abolition of the restrictions on the right of association, the right to strike, etc., which was then to be sent to the State Duma. The liquidators managed to collect only 1,300 signatures at a time when hundreds of thousands of workers backed the revolutionary slogans of the Bolsheviks. The working class followed the path indicated by the Bolsheviks. The economic situation in the country at that period was as follows. In 1910, industrial stagnation had already been succeeded by a revival, an extension of production in the main branches of industry. Whereas the output of pig iron had amounted to 186 million poods in 1910, and to 256 million poods in 1912, in 1913 it amounted to 283 million poods. The output of coal rose from 1,522,000,000 poods in 1910 to 2,214,000,000 poods in 1913. The expansion of capitalist industry was accompanied by a rapid growth of the proletariat. A distinguishing feature of the development of industry was the further concentration of production in large plants. Whereas in 1901 the number of workers engaged in large plants employing 500 workers and over amounted to 46.7% of the total number of workers, the corresponding figure in 1910 was already about 54%, or over half the total number of workers. Such a degree of concentration of industry was unprecedented. Even in a country so industrially developed as the United States, only about one-third the total number of workers were employed in large plants at that period. The growth of the proletariat and its concentration in large enterprises, combined with the existence of such a revolutionary party as the Bolshevik Party, were converting the working class of Russia into the greatest force in the political life of the country. The barbarous methods of exploitation of the workers practiced in the factories, combined with the intolerable police regime of the Tsarist underlings, lent every big strike a political character. Furthermore, the intertwining of the economic and political struggles imparted exceptional revolutionary force to the mass strikes. In the van of the revolutionary working class movement marched the heroic proletariat of St. Petersburg Street. Petersburg was followed by the Baltic provinces, Moscow and the Moscow province, the Volga region and the south of Russia. In 1913 the movement spread to the western territory, Poland and the Caucasus. In all, 725,000 workers, according to official figures, and over 1 million workers according to fuller statistics, took part in strikes in 1912, and 861,000 according to official figures, and 1,272,000 according to fuller statistics, took part in strikes in 1913. In the first half of 1914 the number of strikers already amounted to about 1.5 million. Thus the revolutionary rise of 1912–14, the sweep of the strike movement, created a situation in the country similar to that which had existed at the beginning of the revolution of 1905. The revolutionary mass strikes of the proletariat were of moment to the whole people. They were directed against the autocracy, and they met with the sympathy of the vast majority of the laboring population. The manufacturers retaliated by locking out the workers. In 1913, in the Moscow province, the capitalists threw 50,000 textile workers on the streets. In March 1914, 70,000 workers were discharged in St. Petersburg in a single day. The workers of other factories and branches of industry assisted the strikers and their locked-out comrades by mass collections and sometimes by sympathy strikes. The rising working class movement and the mass strikes also stirred up the peasants and drew them into the struggle. The peasants again began to rise against the landlords. They destroyed manors and kulak farmholds. In the years 1910–14 there were over 13,000 outbreaks of peasant disaffection. Revolutionary outbreaks also took place among the armed forces. In 1912 there was an armed revolt of troops in Turkestan. Revolt was brewing in the Baltic Fleet and in Sevastopol. The revolutionary strike movement and demonstrations, led by the Bolshevik Party, showed that the working class was fighting not for partial demands, not for reforms, but for the liberation of the people from tsardom. The country was heading for a new revolution. In the summer of 1912, Lenin removed from Paris to Galicia, formerly Austria, in order to be nearer to Russia. Here he presided over 2 conferences of members of the Central Committee and leading party workers, one of which took place in Krakow at the end of 1912, and the other in Poronino, a small town near Krakow, in the autumn of 1913. These conferences adopted decisions on important questions of the working class movement, the rise in the revolutionary movement, the tasks of the party in connection with the strikes, the strengthening of the illegal organizations, the Social Democratic group in the Duma, the party press, the labor insurance campaign. 2. The Bolshevik newspaper, Pravda, the Bolshevik group in the 4th State Duma. A powerful instrument used by the Bolshevik Party to strengthen its organizations and to spread its influence among the masses was the Bolshevik daily newspaper Pravda, Truth, published in St. Petersburg. It was founded, according to Lenin's instructions, on the initiative of Stalin, Ulmansky and Poletayev. Pravda was a mass working-class paper founded simultaneously with the new rise of the revolutionary movement. Its first issue appeared on April 22, May 5, New Style, 1912. This was a day of real celebration for the workers. In honor of Pravda's appearance, it was decided henceforward to celebrate May 5 as Workers' Press Day. Previous to the appearance of Pravda, the Bolsheviks already had a weekly newspaper called Zvezda, intended for advanced workers. Zvezda played an important part at the time of the Lena events. It printed a number of trenchant political articles by Lenin and Stalin which mobilized the working class for the struggle. But in view of the rising revolutionary tide, a weekly newspaper no longer met the requirements of the Bolshevik Party. A daily mass political newspaper designed for the broadest sections of the workers was needed. Pravda was such a newspaper. Pravda played an exceptionally important part at this period. It gained support for Bolshevism among broad masses of the working class. Because of incessant police persecution, fines, and confiscations of issues due to the publication of articles and letters not to the liking of the censor, Pravda could exist only with the active support of tens of thousands of advanced workers. Pravda was able to pay the huge fines only thanks to large collections made among the workers. Not infrequently, considerable portions of confiscated issues of Pravda nevertheless found their way into the hands of readers, because the more active workers would come to the printing shop at night and carry away bundles of the newspaper. The Tsarist government suppressed Pravda 8 times in the space of 2.5 years, but each time, with the support of the workers, it reappeared under a new but similar name, e.g., Za Pravda, for truth, Put Pravdi, path of truth, Trudovaya Pravda, labor. Truth. While the average circulation of Pravda was 40,000 copies per day, the circulation of Luch, Ray, the Menshevik daily, did not exceed 15,000 or 16,000. From Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution. The workers regarded Pravda as their own newspaper. They had great confidence in it and were very responsive to its calls. Every copy was read by scores of readers, passing from hand to hand. It molded their class consciousness, educated them, organized them, and summoned them to the struggle. What did Pravda write about? Every issue contained dozens of letters from workers describing their life, the savage exploitation and the various forms of oppression and humiliation they suffered at the hands of the capitalists, their managers and foremen. These were trenchant and telling indictments of capitalist conditions. Pravda often reported cases of suicide of unemployed and starving workers who had lost hope of ever finding jobs again. Pravda wrote of the needs and demands of the workers of various factories and branches of industry, and told how the workers were fighting for their demands. Almost every issue contained reports of strikes at various factories. In big and protracted strikes, the newspaper helped to organize collections among the workers of other factories and branches of industry for the support of the strikers. Sometimes tens of thousands of rubles were collected for the strike funds, huge sums for those days when the majority of the workers received not more than 70 or 80 kopecks per day. This fostered a spirit of proletarian solidarity among the workers and a consciousness of the unity of interests of all workers. The workers reacted to every political event, to every victory or defeat, by sending to Pravda letters, greetings, protests, etc. In its articles, Pravda dealt with the tasks of the working class movement from a consistent Bolshevik standpoint. A legally published newspaper could not call openly for the overthrow of TSRdom. It had to resort to hints, which, however, the class-conscious workers understood very well, and which they explained to the masses. When, for example, Pravda wrote of the full and uncurtailed demands of the year 5, the workers understood that this meant the revolutionary slogans of the Bolsheviks, namely, the overthrow of TSRdom, a democratic republic, the confiscation of the landed estates, and an 8-hour day. Pravda organized the advanced workers on the eve of the elections to the Fourth Duma. It exposed the treacherous position of those who advocated an agreement with the liberal bourgeoisie, the advocates of the Stolypin Labor Party, the Mensheviks. Pravda called upon the workers to vote for those who advocated the full and uncurtailed demands of the year 5, that is, the Bolsheviks. The elections were indirect, held in a series of stages. First, meetings of workers elected delegates. Then these delegates chose electors, and it was these electors who participated in the elections of the workers' deputy to the Duma. On the day of the elections of the electors, Pravda published a list of Bolshevik candidates and recommended the workers to vote for this list. The list could not be published earlier without exposing those on the list to the danger of arrest. Pravda helped to organize the mass actions of the proletariat. At the time of a big lockout in St. Petersburg in the spring of 1914, when it was inexpedient to declare a mass strike, Pravda called upon the workers to resort to other forms of struggle, such as mass meetings in the factories and demonstrations in the streets. This could not be stated openly in the newspaper. But the call was understood by class-conscious workers when they read an article by Lenin bearing the modest title, Forms of the Working Class Movement, and stating that at the given moment strikes should yield place to a higher form of the working class movement, which meant a call to organize meetings and demonstrations. In this way, the illegal revolutionary activities of the Bolsheviks were combined with legal forms of agitation and organization of the masses of the workers through Pravda. Pravda not only wrote of the life of the workers, their strikes and demonstrations, but also regularly described the life of the peasants, the famines from which they suffered, their exploitation by the feudal landlords. It described how, as a result of the Stolypin reform, the kulak farmers robbed the peasants of the best parts of their land. Pravda drew the attention of the class-conscious workers to the widespread and burning discontent in the countryside. It taught the proletariat that the objectives of the revolution of 1905 had not been attained, and that a new revolution was impending. It taught that in this second revolution the proletariat must act as the real leader and guide of the people, and that in this revolution it would have so powerful an ally as the revolutionary peasantry. The Mensheviks worked to get the proletariat to drop the idea of revolution, to stop thinking of the people, of the starvation of the peasants, of the domination of the Black Hundred feudal landlords, and to fight only for freedom of association, to present petitions to this effect to the Tsarist government. The Bolsheviks explained to the workers that this Menshevik gospel of renunciation of revolution, renunciation of an alliance with the peasantry, was being preached in the interests of the bourgeoisie, that the workers would most certainly defeat TSRDM if they won over the peasantry as their ally, and that bad shepherds like the Mensheviks should be driven out as enemies of the revolution. What did Pravda write about in its Peasant Life section? Let us take, as an example, several letters relating to the year 1913. One letter from Samara, headed, An Agrarian Case, reports that 45 peasants of the village of Novohospolet, Bugulma Uyezd, accused of interfering with a surveyor who was marking out communal land to be allotted to peasants withdrawing from the commune, the majority were condemned to long terms of imprisonment. A brief letter from the Pskov province states that the peasants of the village of Sitsa, near Zavali station, offered armed resistance to the rural police. Several persons were wounded. The clash was due to an agrarian dispute. Rural police have been dispatched to Sitsa, and the vice-governor and the procurator are on the way to the village. A letter from the Ufa province reported that peasants' allotments were being sold off in great numbers, and that famine and the law permitting withdrawal from the village communes were causing increasing numbers of peasants to lose their land. Take the hamlet of Borisovka. Here there are 27 peasant households owning 543 desiatins of arable land between them. During the famine 5 peasants sold 31 desiatins outright at prices varying from 25 to 33 rubles per desiatin, though land is worth 3 or 4 times as much. In this village, too, 7 peasants have mortgaged between them 177 desiatins of arable land, receiving 18 to 20 rubles per desiatin for a term of 6 years at a rate of 12% per annum. When the poverty of the population and the usurious rate of interest are borne in mind, it may be safely said that half of the 177 desiatins is bound to pass into the possession of the usurer, for it is not likely that even half the debtors can repay so large a sum in 6 years. In an article printed in Pravda and entitled, Big Landlord and Small Peasant Land Ownership in Russia, Lenin strikingly demonstrated to the workers and peasants what tremendous landed property was in the hands of the parasite landlords. 30,000 big landlords alone owned about 70 million desiatins of land between them. An equal area fell to the share of 10 million peasant households. On an average, the big landlords owned 2,300 desiatins each, while peasant households, including the kulaks, owned 7 desiatins each. Moreover, 5 million households of small peasants, that is, half the peasantry, owned no more than 1 or 2 desiatins each. These figures clearly showed that the root of the poverty of the peasants and the recurrent famines lay in the large landed estates, in the survivals of serfdom, of which the peasants could rid themselves only by a revolution led by the working class. Through workers connected with the countryside, Pravda found its way into the villages and roused the politically advanced peasants to a revolutionary struggle. At the time Pravda was founded, the illegal social democratic organizations were entirely under the direction of the Bolsheviks. On the other hand, the legal forms of organization, such as the Duma Group, the press, the sick benefit societies, the trade unions, had not yet been fully wrested from the Mensheviks. The Bolsheviks had to wage a determined struggle to drive the liquidators out of the legally existing organizations of the working class. Thanks to Pravda, this fight ended in victory. Pravda stood in the center of the struggle for the party principle, for the building up of a mass working-class revolutionary party. Pravda rallied the legally existing organizations around the illegal centers of the Bolshevik Party and directed the working-class movement towards one definite aim: preparation for revolution. Pravda had a vast number of worker correspondents. In 1 year alone it printed over 11,000 letters from workers. But it was not only by letters that Pravda maintained contact with the working-class masses. Numbers of workers from the factories visited the editorial office every day. In the Pravda editorial office was concentrated a large share of the organizational work of the party. Here meetings were arranged with representatives from party nuclei. Here reports were received of party work in the mills and factories, and from here were transmitted the instructions of the St. Petersburg Committee and the Central Committee of the party. As a result of 2.5 years of persistent struggle against the liquidators for the building up of a mass revolutionary working-class party, by the summer of 1914 the Bolsheviks had succeeded in winning the support of 4/5 of the politically active workers of Russia for the Bolshevik Party and for the Pravda tactics. This was borne out, for instance, by the fact that out of a total number of 7,000 workers' groups which collected money for the labor press in 1914, 5,600 groups collected for the Bolshevik press, and only 1,400 groups for the Menshevik press. But, on the other hand, the Mensheviks had a large number of rich friends among the liberal bourgeoisie and the bourgeois intelligentsia who advanced over half the funds required for the maintenance of the Menshevik newspaper. The Bolsheviks at that time were called Pravdas. A whole generation of the revolutionary proletariat was reared by Pravda, the generation which subsequently made the October Socialist Revolution. Pravda was backed by tens and hundreds of thousands of workers. Tian was laid of a mass Bolshevik party, a foundation which no persecution by TSRDM could destroy during the imperialist war. The Pravda of 1912 was the laying of the cornerstone of the victory of Bolshevism in 1917. Stalin. Another legally functioning central organ of the party was the Bolshevik group in the Fourth State Duma. In 1912 the government decreed elections to the Fourth Duma. Our party attributed great importance to participation in the elections. The Duma Social Democratic Group and Pravda were the chief bases of the revolutionary work of the Bolshevik Party among the masses, functioning legally on a countrywide scale. The Bolshevik Party acted independently, under its own slogans, in the Duma elections, simultaneously attacking both the government parties and the liberal bourgeoisie, constitutional Democrats. The slogans of the Bolsheviks in the election campaign were a democratic republic, an 8-hour day and the confiscation of the landed estates. The elections to the Fourth Duma were held in the autumn of 1912. At the beginning of October, the government, dissatisfied with the course of the elections in St. Petersburg, tried to encroach on the electoral rights of the workers in a number of the large factories. In reply, the St. Petersburg Committee of our party, on Comrade Stalin's proposal, called upon the workers of the large factories to declare a one-day strike. Placed in a difficult position, the government was forced to yield, and the workers were able at their meetings to elect whom they wanted. The vast majority of the workers voted for the mandate, nakaz, to their delegates and the deputy, which had been drawn up by Comrade Stalin. The mandate of the working men of St. Petersburg to their labor deputy called attention to the unaccomplished tasks of 1905. We think, the mandate stated, that Russia is on the eve of the onset of mass movements, which will perhaps be more profound than in 1905. As in 1905, in the van of these movements will be the most advanced class in Russian society, the Russian proletariat. Its only ally can be the much-suffering peasantry, which is vitally interested in the emancipation of Russia. The mandate declared that the future actions of the people should take the form of a struggle on two fronts, against the Tsarist government and against the liberal bourgeoisie, which was seeking to come to terms with TSRDM. Lenin attached great importance to the mandate, which called the workers to a revolutionary struggle. And in their resolutions the workers responded to this call. The Bolsheviks scored a victory in the elections, and Comrade Badaev was elected to the Duma by the workers of St. Petersburg. The workers voted in the elections to the Duma separately from other sections of the population. This was known as the Worker Curia. Of the 9 deputies elected from the Worker Curia, 6 were members of the Bolshevik Party: Badaev, Petrovsky, Mironov, Samoylov, Shagov and Malinovsky. The latter subsequently turned out to be an agent provocateur. The Bolshevik deputies were elected from the big industrial centers, in which not less than 4/5 of the working class were concentrated. On the other hand, several of the elected liquidators did not get their mandates from the Worker Curia, that is, were not elected by the workers. The result was that there were 7 liquidators in the Duma as against 6 Bolsheviks. At first the Bolsheviks and liquidators formed a joint social democratic group in the Duma. In October 1913, after a stubborn struggle against the liquidators, who hampered the revolutionary work of the Bolsheviks, the Bolshevik deputies, on the instructions of the Central Committee of the party, withdrew from the joint social democratic group and formed an independent Bolshevik group. The Bolshevik deputies made revolutionary speeches in the Duma in which they exposed the autocratic system and interpellated the government on cases of repression of the workers and on the inhuman exploitation of the workers by the capitalists. They also spoke in the Duma on the agrarian question, calling upon the peasants to fight the feudal landlords, and exposing the Constitutional Democratic Party, which was opposed to the confiscation and handing over of the landed estates to the peasants. The Bolsheviks introduced a bill in the State Duma providing for an 8-hour working day. Of course, it was not adopted by this Black Hundred Duma, but it had great agitational value. The Bolshevik group in the Duma maintained close connections with the Central Committee of the party and with Lenin, from whom they received instructions. They were directly guided by Comrade Stalin while he was living in St. Petersburg. The Bolshevik deputies did not confine themselves to work within the Duma, but were very active outside the Duma as well. Claimed the decisions of the party, and formed new party organizations. The deputies skillfully combined legal activities with illegal, underground work. 3. Victory of the Bolsheviks in the legally existing organizations, continued rise of the revolutionary movement. Eve of the imperialist war. The Bolshevik Party during this period set an example of leadership in all forms and manifestations of the class struggle of the proletariat. It built up illegal organizations. It issued illegal leaflets. It carried on secret revolutionary work among the masses. At the same time, it steadily gained the leadership of the various legally existing organizations of the working class. The party strove to win over the trade unions and gain influence in people's houses, evening universities, clubs and sick benefit societies. These legally existing organizations had long served as the refuge of the liquidators. The Bolsheviks started an energetic struggle to convert the legally existing societies into strongholds of our party. By skillfully combining illegal work with legal work, the Bolsheviks won over a majority of the trade union organizations in the two capital cities, St. Petersburg and Moscow. Particularly brilliant was the victory gained in the election of the Executive Committee of the Metal Workers' Union in St. Petersburg in 1913. Of the 3,000 metalworkers attending the meeting, barely 150 voted for the liquidators. The same may be said of so important a legal organization as the Social Democratic Group in the Fourth State Duma. Although the Mensheviks had 7 deputies in the Duma and the Bolsheviks 6, the Menshevik deputies, chiefly elected from non-working class districts, represented barely 1/5 of the working class, whereas the Bolshevik deputies, who were elected from the principal industrial centers of the country, St. Petersburg, Moscow, Ivanovo-Voznesensk, Kostroma, Ekaterinoslav and Kharkiv, represented over 4/5 of the working class of the country. The workers regarded the 6 Bolsheviks, Badaev, Petrovsky and the others, and not the 7 Mensheviks as their deputies. The Bolsheviks succeeded in winning over the legally existing organizations because, in spite of savage persecution by the Tsarist government and vilification by the liquidators and the Trotskyites, they were able to preserve the illegal party and maintain firm discipline in their ranks. They staunchly defended the interests of the working class, had close connections with the masses, and waged an uncompromising struggle against the enemies of the working class movement. Thus, the victory of the Bolsheviks and the defeat of the Mensheviks in the legally existing organizations developed all along the line, both in respect to agitational work from the platform of the Duma and in respect to the labor press and other legally existing organizations. The Mensheviks were forced into the background. The revolutionary movement took strong hold of the working class, which definitely rallied around the Bolsheviks and swept the Mensheviks aside. To culminate all, the Mensheviks also proved bankrupt as far as the national question was concerned. The revolutionary movement in the border regions of Russia demanded a clear program on the national question. But the Mensheviks had no program, except the cultural autonomy of the Bund, which could satisfy nobody. Only the Bolsheviks had a Marxist program on the national question, as set forth in Comrade Stalin's article, Marxism and the National Question, and in Lenin's articles, The Right of Nations to Self-Determination, and Critical Notes on the National Question. It is not surprising that after the Mensheviks had suffered such defeats, the August Bloc should begin to break up. Composed as it was of heterogeneous elements, it could not withstand the onslaught of the Bolsheviks and began to fall apart. Formed for the purpose of combating Bolshevism, the August Bloc soon went to pieces under the blows of the Bolsheviks. The first to quit the bloc were the Vperiodytes, Bogdanov, Lunacharsky and others. Next went the Lets, and the rest followed suit. Having suffered defeat in their struggle against the Bolsheviks, the liquidators appealed for help to the Second International. The Second International came to their aid. Under the pretense of acting as a conciliator between the Bolsheviks and the liquidators and establishing peace in the party, the Second International demanded that the Bolsheviks should desist from criticizing the compromising policy of the liquidators. But the Bolsheviks were irreconcilable. They refused to abide by the decisions of the opportunist Second International and would agree to make no concessions. The victory of the Bolsheviks in the legally existing organizations was not, and could not have been, accidental. It was not accidental, not only because the Bolsheviks alone had a correct Marxist theory, a clear program, and a revolutionary proletarian party which had been steeled and tempered in battle, but also because the victory of the Bolsheviks reflected the rising tide of revolution. The revolutionary movement of the workers steadily developed, spreading to town after town and region after region. In the beginning of 1914, the workers' strikes, far from subsiding, acquired a new momentum. They became more and more stubborn and embraced ever larger numbers of workers. On January 9, 250,000 workers were on strike, St. Petersburg accounting for 140,000. On May 1, over 500,000 workers were on strike, St. Petersburg accounting for more than 250,000. The workers displayed unusual steadfastness in the strikes. A strike at the Obakov works in St. Petersburg lasted for over 2 months, and another at the Lesnar works for about 3 months. Wholesale poisoning of workers at a number of St. Petersburg factories was the cause of a strike of 115,000 workers, which was accompanied by demonstrations. The movement continued to spread. In the first half of 1914, including the early part of July, a total of 1,425,000 workers took part in strikes. In May, a general strike of oil workers, which broke out in Baku, focused the attention of the whole proletariat of Russia. The strike was conducted in an organized way. On June 20, a demonstration of 20,000 workers was held in Baku. The police adopted ferocious measures against the Baku workers. A strike broke out in Moscow as a mark of protest and solidarity with the Baku workers and spread to other districts. On July 3 a meeting was held at the Putilov Works in St. Petersburg in connection with the Baku strike. The police fired on the workers. A wave of indignation swept over the St. Petersburg proletariat. On July 4, at the call of the St. Petersburg Party Committee, 90,000. St. Petersburg workers stopped work in protest. The number rose to 130,000 on July 7, 150,000 on July 8 and 200,000 on July 11. Unrest spread to all the factories, and meetings and demonstrations were held everywhere. The workers even started to throw up barricades. Barricades were erected also in Baku and Lodz. In a number of places the police fired on the workers. The government adopted emergency measures to suppress the movement. The capital was turned into an armed camp. Pravda was suppressed. But at that moment a new factor, one of international import, appeared on the arena. This was the imperialist war, which was to change the whole course of events. It was during the revolutionary developments of July that Poincaré, the French president, arrived in St. Petersburg to discuss with the Tsar the war that was about to begin. A few days later Germany declared war on Russia. The Tsarist government took advantage of the war to smash the Bolshevik organizations and to crush the working class movement. The advance of the revolution was interrupted by the World War, in which the Tsarist government sought salvation from revolution. BRIEFSUMMARY. During the period of the new rise of the revolution, 1912-14, the Bolshevik Party headed the working class movement and led it forward to a new revolution under Bolshevik slogans. The party ably combined illegal work with legal work. Smashing the resistance of the liquidators and their friends, the Trotskyites and Otzevists, the party gained the leadership of all forms of the legal movement and turned the legally existing organizations into bases of its revolutionary work. In the fight against the enemies of the working class and their agents within the working class movement, the party consolidated its ranks and extended its connections with the working class. Making wide use of the Duma as a platform for revolutionary agitation, and having founded a splendid mass workers' newspaper, Pravda, the party trained a new generation of revolutionary workers, the Pravdists. During the imperialist war this section of the workers remained faithful to the banner of internationalism and proletarian revolution. It subsequently formed the core of the Bolshevik Party during the Revolution of October 1917. On the eve of the imperialist war the party led the working class in its revolutionary actions. These were vanguard engagements which were interrupted by the imperialist war only to be resumed 3 years later to end in the overthrow of TSRDM. The Bolshevik Party entered the difficult period of the imperialist war with the banners of proletarian internationalism unfurled. From Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution. CHAPTERSIX. The Bolshevik Party in the period of the imperialist war. The Second Revolution in Russia, 1914, March 1917. 1. Outbreak and causes of the imperialist war. On July 14, 27, New Style, 1914, the Tsarist government proclaimed a general mobilization. On July 19, August 1, New Style, Germany declared war on Russia. Russia entered the war. Long before the actual outbreak of the war the Bolsheviks, headed by Lenin, had foreseen that it was inevitable. At international socialist congresses Lenin had put forward proposals the purpose of which was to determine a revolutionary line of conduct for the socialists in the event of war. Lenin had pointed out that war is an inevitable concomitant of capitalism. Plunder of foreign territory, seizure and spoliation of colonies and the capture of new markets had many times already served as causes of wars of conquest waged by capitalist states. For capitalist countries war is just as natural and legitimate a condition of things as the exploitation of the working class. Wars became inevitable particularly when, at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, capitalism definitely entered the highest and last stage of its development, imperialism. Under imperialism the powerful capitalist associations, monopolies, and the banks acquired a dominant position in the life of the capitalist states. Finance capital became master in the capitalist states. Finance capital demanded new markets, the seizure of new colonies, new fields for the export of capital, new sources of raw material. But by the end of the 19th century the whole territory of the globe had already been divided up among the capitalist states. Yet in the era of imperialism the development of capitalism proceeds extremely unevenly and by leaps. Some countries, which previously held a foremost position, now develop their industry at a relatively slow rate, while others, which were formerly backward, overtake and outstrip them by 160. Rapid leaps. The relative economic and military strength of the imperialist states was undergoing a change. There arose a striving for a redivision of the world, and the struggle for this redivision made imperialist war inevitable. The War of 1914 was a war for the redivision of the world and of spheres of influence. All the imperialist states had long been preparing for it. The imperialists of all countries were responsible for the war. But in particular, preparations for this war were made by Germany and Austria, on the one hand, and by France and Great Britain, as well as by Russia, which was dependent on the latter two, on the other. The Triple Entente, an alliance of Great Britain, France and Russia, was formed in 1907. Germany, Austria-Hungary and Italy formed another imperialist alliance. But on the outbreak of the War of 1914, Italy left this alliance and later joined the Entente. Germany and Austria-Hungary were supported by Bulgaria and Turkey. Germany prepared for the imperialist war with the design of taking away colonies from Great Britain and France, and the Ukraine, Poland and the Baltic provinces from Russia. By building the Baghdad Railway, Germany created a menace to Britain's domination in the Near East. Great Britain feared the growth of Germany's naval armaments. Tsarist Russia strove for the partition of Turkey and dreamed of seizing Constantinople and the straits leading from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean, the Dardanelles. The plans of the Tsarist government also included the seizure of Galicia, a part of Austria-Hungary. Great Britain strove by means of war to smash its dangerous competitor, Germany, whose goods before the war were steadily driving British goods out of the world markets. In addition, Great Britain intended to seize Mesopotamia and Palestine from Turkey and to secure a firm foothold in Egypt. The French capitalists strove to take away from Germany the Saar Basin and Alsace-Lorraine, two rich coal and iron regions, the latter of which Germany had seized from France in the War of 1870–71. Thus the imperialist war was brought about by profound antagonisms between two groups of capitalist states. This rapacious war for the redivision of the world affected the interests of all the imperialist countries, with the result that Japan, the United States and a number of other countries were subsequently drawn into it. The war became a world war. The bourgeoisie kept the preparations for imperialist war a profound secret from their people. Government endeavored to prove that it had not attacked its neighbors, but had been attacked by them. The bourgeoisie deceived the people, concealing the true aims of the war and its imperialist, annexationist character. Each imperialist government declared that it was waging war in defense of its country. The opportunists of the Second International helped the bourgeoisie to deceive the people. The Social Democrats of the Second International vilely betrayed the cause of socialism, the cause of the international solidarity of the proletariat. Far from opposing the war, they assisted the bourgeoisie in inciting the workers and peasants of the belligerent countries against each other on the plea of defending the fatherland. That Russia entered the imperialist war on the side of the Entente, on the side of France and Great Britain, was not accidental. It should be borne in mind that before 1914 the most important branches of Russian industry were in the hands of foreign capitalists, chiefly those of France, Great Britain and Belgium, that is, the Entente countries. The most important of Russia's metalworks were in the hands of French capitalists. In all, about 3/4, 72%, of the metal industry depended on foreign capital. The same was true of the coal industry of the Donets Basin. Oilfields owned by British and French capital accounted for about half the oil output of the country. A considerable part of the profits of Russian industry flowed into foreign banks, chiefly British and French. All these circumstances, in addition to the thousands of millions borrowed by the Tsar from France and Britain in loans, chained TSRdom to British and French imperialism and converted Russia into a tributary, a semi-colony of these countries. The Russian bourgeoisie went to war with the purpose of improving its position, to seize new markets, to make huge profits on war contracts, and at the same time to crush the revolutionary movement by taking advantage of the war situation. Tsarist Russia was not ready for war. Russian industry lagged far behind that of other capitalist countries. It consisted predominantly of out-of-date mills and factories with worn-out machinery. Owing to the existence of land ownership based on semi-serfdom, and the vast numbers of impoverished and ruined peasants, her agriculture could not provide a solid economic base for a prolonged war. The chief mainstay of the Tsar was the feudal landlords. The Black Hundred big landlords, in alliance with the big capitalists, domineered the country and the State Duma. They wholly supported the home and foreign policy of the Tsarist government. The Russian imperialist bourgeoisie placed its hopes in the Tsarist autocracy as a mailed fist that could ensure the seizure of new markets and new territories, on the one hand, and crush the revolutionary movement of the workers and peasants, on the other. The party of the liberal bourgeoisie, the Constitutional Democratic Party, made a show of opposition, but supported the foreign policy of the Tsarist government unreservedly. From the very outbreak of the war, the petty bourgeois parties, the Socialist Revolutionaries and the Mensheviks, using the flag of socialism as a screen, helped the bourgeoisie to deceive the people by concealing the imperialist, predatory character of the war. They preached the necessity of defending, of protecting the bourgeois fatherland from the Prussian barbarians. They supported a policy of civil peace, and thus helped the government of the Russian Tsar to wage war, just as the German Social Democrats helped the government of the German Kaiser to wage war on the Russian barbarians. Only the Bolshevik Party remained faithful to the great cause of revolutionary internationalism and firmly adhered to the Marxist position of a resolute struggle against the Tsarist autocracy, against the landlords and capitalists, against the imperialist war. From the very outbreak of the war, the Bolshevik Party maintained that it had been started, not for the defense of the country, but for the seizure of foreign territory, for the spoliation of foreign nations in the interests of the landlords and capitalists, and that the workers must wage a determined war on this war. The working class supported the Bolshevik Party. True, the bourgeois jingoism displayed in the early days of the war by the intelligentsia and the kulak sections of the peasantry also infected a certain section of the workers. But these were chiefly members of the ruffian League of the Russian People, and some workers who were under the influence of the socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks. They naturally did not, and could not, reflect the sentiments of the working class. It was these elements who took part in the jingo demonstrations of the bourgeoisie engineered by the Tsarist government in the early days of the war. 2. Parties of the Second International side with their imperialist governments. Disintegration of the Second International into separate social chauvinist parties. Lenin had time and again warned against the opportunism of the Second International and the wavering attitude of its leaders. He had always insisted that the leaders of the Second International only talked of being opposed to war, and that if war were to break out they would change their attitude, desert to the side of the imperialist bourgeoisie and become supporters of the war. What Lenin had foretold was borne out in the very first days of the war. In 1910, at the Copenhagen Congress of the Second International, it was decided that socialists in parliament should vote against war credits. At the time of the Balkan War of 1912, the Ball World Congress of the Second International declared that the workers of all countries considered it a crime to shoot one another for the sake of increasing the profits of the capitalists. That is what they said, that is what they proclaimed in their resolutions. But when the storm burst, when the imperialist war broke out, and the time had come to put these decisions into effect, the leaders of the Second International proved to be traitors, betrayers of the proletariat and servitors of the bourgeoisie. They became supporters of the war. On August 4, 1914, the German Social Democrats in Parliament voted for the war credits. They voted to support the imperialist war. So did the overwhelming majority of the socialists in France, Great Britain, Belgium and other countries. The Second International ceased to exist. Actually, it broke up into separate social chauvinist parties which warred against each other. The leaders of the socialist parties betrayed the proletariat and adopted the position of social chauvinism in defense of the imperialist bourgeoisie. They helped the imperialist governments to hoodwink the working class and to poison it with the venom of nationalism. Using the defense of the fatherland as a plea, these social traitors began to incite the German workers against the French workers, and the British and French workers against the German workers. Only an insignificant minority of the Second International kept to the internationalist position and went against the current. True, they did not do so confidently and definitely enough, but go against the current they did. Only the Bolshevik Party immediately and unhesitatingly raised the banner of determined struggle against the imperialist war. In the theses on the war that Lenin wrote in the autumn of 1914, he pointed out that the fall of the Second International was not accidental. The Second International had been ruined by the opportunists, against whom the foremost representatives of the revolutionary proletariat had long been warning. The parties of the Second International had already been infected by opportunism before the war. The opportunists had openly preached renunciation of the revolutionary struggle. They had preached the theory of the peaceful growing of capitalism into socialism. The Second International did not want to combat opportunism. It wanted to live in peace with opportunism, and allowed it to gain a firm hold. Pursuing a conciliatory policy towards opportunism, the Second International itself became opportunist. The imperialist bourgeoisie systematically bribed the upper stratum of skilled workers, the so-called labor aristocracy, by means of higher wages and other sops, using for this purpose part of the profits it derived from the colonies, from the exploitation of backward countries. This section of workers had produced quite a number of trade union and cooperative leaders, members of municipal and parliamentary bodies, journalists and functionaries of social democratic organizations. When the war broke out, these people, fearing to lose their positions, became foes of revolution and most zealous defenders of their own bourgeoisies, of their own imperialist governments. The opportunists became social chauvinists. The social chauvinists, the Russian Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries among their number, preached class peace between the workers and the bourgeoisie at home and war on other nations abroad. They deceived the masses by concealing from them who was really responsible for the war and declaring that the bourgeoisie of their particular country was not to blame. Many social chauvinists became ministers of the imperialist governments of their countries. No less dangerous to the cause of the proletariat were the covert social chauvinists, the so-called centrists. The centrists, Kautsky, Trotsky, Mardov and others, justified and defended the avowed social chauvinists, thus joining the social chauvinists in betraying the proletariat. They masked their treachery by leftist Talk about combating the war. Talk designed to deceive the working class. As a matter of fact, the centrists supported the war, for their proposal not to vote against war credits, but merely to abstain when a vote on the credits was being taken, meant supporting the war. Like the social chauvinists, they demanded the renunciation of the class struggle during the war so as not to hamper their particular imperialist government in waging the war. The centrist Trotsky opposed Lenin and the Bolshevik Party on all the important questions of the war and socialism. From the very outbreak of the war, Lenin began to muster forces for the creation of a new international, the Third International. In the manifesto against the war it issued in November 1914, the Central Committee of the Bolshevik Party already called for the formation of the Third International in place of the Second International, which had suffered disgraceful bankruptcy. In February 1915, a conference of socialists of the Entente countries was held in London. Comrade Litvinov, on Lenin's instructions, spoke at this conference demanding that the socialists, Vandervelde, Sembat and Geste, should resign from the bourgeois government of Belgium and France, completely break with the imperialists and refuse to collaborate with them. He demanded that all socialists should wage a determined struggle against their imperialist governments and condemn the voting of war credits. But no voice in support of Litvinov was raised at this conference. At the beginning of September 1915, the first conference of internationalists was held in Zimmerwald. Lenin called this conference the first step in the development of an international movement against the war. At this conference Lenin formed the Zimmerwald Left Group. But within the Zimmerwald Left Group only the Bolshevik Party, headed by Lenin, took a correct and thoroughly consistent stand against the war. The Zimmerwald Left Group published a magazine in German called the Vorbote Herald, to which Lenin contributed articles. In 1916, the internationalists succeeded in convening a second conference in the Swiss village of Kienthal. It is known as the Second Zimmerwald Conference. By this time groups of internationalists had been formed in nearly every country and the cleavage between the internationalist elements and the social chauvinists had become more sharply defined. But the most important thing was that by this time the masses themselves had shifted to the left under the influence of the war and its attendant distress. The manifesto drawn up by the Kienthal Conference was the result of an agreement between various conflicting groups. It was an advance on the Zimmerwald Manifesto. But like the Zimmerwald Conference, the Kienthal Conference did not accept the basic principles of the Bolshevik policy, namely, the conversion of the imperialist war into a civil war, the defeat of one's own imperialist government in the war, and the formation of the Third International. Nevertheless, the Kienthal Conference helped to crystallize the internationalist elements of whom the Communist Third International was subsequently formed. Lenin criticized the mistakes of the inconsistent internationalists among the left Social Democrats, such as Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, but at the same time he helped them to take the correct position. 3. Theory and tactics of the Bolshevik Party on the question of war, peace and revolution. The Bolsheviks were not mere pacifists who sighed for peace and confined themselves to the propaganda of peace, as the majority of the left Social Democrats did. The Bolsheviks advocated an active revolutionary struggle for peace, to the point of overthrowing the rule of the bellicose imperialist bourgeoisie. The Bolsheviks linked up the cause of peace with the cause of the victory of the proletarian revolution, holding that the surest way of ending the war and securing a just peace, a peace without annexations and indemnities, was to overthrow the rule of the imperialist bourgeoisie. In opposition to the Menshevik and Socialist revolutionary renunciation of revolution and their treacherous slogan of preserving civil peace in time of war, the Bolsheviks advanced the slogan of converting the imperialist war into a civil war. This slogan meant that the laboring people, including the armed workers and peasants clad in soldiers' uniform, were to turn their weapons against their own bourgeoisie and overthrow its rule if they wanted to put an end to the war and achieve a just peace. In opposition to the Menshevik and Socialist revolutionary policy of defending the bourgeois fatherland, the Bolsheviks advanced the policy of the defeat of one's own government in the imperialist war. This meant voting against war credits, forming illegal revolutionary organizations in the armed forces, supporting fraternization among the soldiers at the front, organizing revolutionary actions of the workers and peasants against the war, and turning these actions into an uprising against one's own imperialist government. The Bolsheviks maintained that the lesser evil for the people would be the military defeat of the Tsarist government in the imperialist war, for this would facilitate the victory of the people over TSRdom and the success of the struggle of the working class for emancipation from capitalist slavery and imperialist wars. Lenin held that the policy of working for the defeat of one's own imperialist government must be pursued not only by the Russian revolutionaries, but by the revolutionary parties of the working class in all the belligerent countries. It was not to every kind of war that the Bolsheviks were opposed. They were only opposed to wars of conquest, imperialist wars. The Bolsheviks held that there are two kinds of war. A. Just wars, wars that are not wars of conquest but wars of liberation, waged to defend the people from foreign attack and from attempt to enslave them, or to liberate the people from capitalist slavery, or, lastly, to liberate colonies and dependent countries from the yoke of imperialism, and b. unjust wars, wars of conquest, waged to conquer and enslave foreign countries and foreign nations. Wars of the first kind the Bolsheviks supported. As to wars of the second kind, the Bolsheviks maintained that a resolute struggle must be waged against them to the point of revolution and the overthrow of one's own imperialist government. Of great importance to the working class of the world was Lenin's theoretical work during the war. In the spring of 1916, Lenin wrote a book entitled Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. In this book he showed that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, a stage at which it has already become transformed from progressive capitalism to parasitic capitalism, decaying capitalism, and that imperialism is moribund capitalism. This, of course, did not mean that capitalism would die away of itself, without a revolution of the proletariat, that it would just rot on the stalk. Lenin always taught that without a revolution of the working class capitalism cannot be overthrown. Therefore, while defining imperialism as moribund capitalism, Lenin at the same time showed that imperialism is the eve of the social revolution of the proletariat. Lenin showed that in the era of imperialism the capitalist yoke becomes more and more oppressive, that under imperialism the revolt of the proletariat against the foundations of capitalism grows, and that the elements of a revolutionary outbreak accumulate in capitalist countries. Lenin showed that in the era of imperialism the revolutionary crisis in the colonial and dependent countries becomes more acute, that the elements of revolt against imperialism, the elements of a war of liberation from imperialism accumulate. Lenin showed that under imperialism the unevenness of development and the contradictions of capitalism have grown particularly acute, that the struggle for markets and fields for the export of capital, the struggle for colonies, for sources of raw material, makes periodical imperialist wars for the redivision of the world inevitable. Lenin showed that it is just this unevenness of development of capitalism that gives rise to imperialist wars, which undermine the strength of imperialism and make it possible to break the front of imperialism at its weakest point. From all this Lenin drew the conclusion that it was quite possible for the proletariat to break the imperialist front in one place or in several places, that the victory of socialism was possible first in several countries or even in one country, taken singly, that the simultaneous victory of socialism in all countries was impossible owing to the unevenness of development of capitalism, and that socialism would be victorious first in one country or in several countries, while the others would remain bourgeois countries for some time longer. Here is the formulation of this brilliant deduction as given by Lenin in two articles written during the imperialist war. 1. Uneven economic and political development is an absolute law of capitalism. Hence, the victory of socialism is possible first in several or even in one capitalist country, taken singly. The victorious proletariat of that country, having expropriated the capitalists and organized its own socialist production, would stand up against the rest of the world, the capitalist world, attracting to its cause the oppressed classes of other countries. From the article, The United States of Europe slogan, written in August, 1915, Lenin. Selected Works, Volume 5, page 141. 2. The development of capitalism proceeds extremely unevenly in the various countries. It cannot be otherwise under the commodity production system. From this it follows irrefutably that socialism cannot achieve victory simultaneously in all countries. It will achieve victory first in one or several countries, while the others will remain bourgeois or pre-bourgeois for some time. This must not only create friction, but a direct striving on the part of the bourgeoisie of other countries to crush the victorious proletariat of the socialist country. In such cases a war on our part would be a legitimate and just war. It would be a war for socialism, for the liberation of other nations from the bourgeoisie. From the article, War Program of the Proletarian Revolution, written in the autumn of 1916, Lenin. Collected Works, Russ. ed. Volume 19, page 325. This was a new and complete theory of the socialist revolution, a theory affirming the possibility of the victory of socialism in separate countries, and indicating the conditions of this victory and its prospects, a theory whose fundamentals were outlined by Lenin as far back as 1905 in his pamphlet, Two Tactics of Social Democracy in the Democratic Revolution. This theory fundamentally differed from the view current among the Marxists in the period of pre-imperialist capitalism, when they held that the victory of socialism in one separate country was impossible, and that it would take place simultaneously in all the civilized countries. On the basis of the facts concerning imperialist capitalism set forth in his remarkable book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, Lenin displaced this view as obsolete and set forth a new theory, from which it follows that the simultaneous victory of socialism in all countries is impossible, while the victory of socialism in one capitalist country, taken singly, is possible. The inestimable importance of Lenin's theory of socialist revolution lies not only in the fact that it has enriched Marxism with a new theory and has advanced Marxism, but also in the fact that it opens up a revolutionary perspective for the proletarians of separate countries, that it unfetters their initiative in the onslaught on their own national bourgeoisie, that it teaches them to take advantage of a war situation to organize this onslaught, and that it strengthens their faith in the victory of the proletarian revolution. Such was the theoretical and tactical stand of the Bolsheviks on the questions of war, peace and revolution. It was on the basis of this stand that the Bolsheviks carried on their practical work in Russia. At the beginning of the war, in spite of severe persecution by the police, the Bolshevik members of the Duma, Badaev, Petrovsky, Mironov, Samoylov and Shagov, visited a number of organizations and addressed them on the policy of the Bolsheviks towards the war and revolution. In November 1914, a conference of the Bolshevik group in the State Duma was convened to discuss policy towards the war. On the third day of the conference, all present were arrested. The court sentenced the Bolshevik members of the State Duma to forfeiture of civil rights and banishment to eastern Siberia. The Tsarist government charged them with high treason. The picture of the activities of the Duma members unfolded in court did credit to our party. The Bolshevik deputies conducted themselves manfully, transforming the Tsarist court into a platform from which they exposed the annexationist policy of TSRDM. Quite different was the conduct of Kamenev, who was also tried in this case. Owing to his cowardice, he abjured the policy of the Bolshevik party at the first contact with danger. Kamenev declared in court that he did not agree with the Bolsheviks on the question of the war, and to prove this he requested that the Menshevik Jordansky be summoned as witness. The Bolsheviks worked very effectively against the war industry. Realist bourgeoisie. It was of vital interest to the bourgeoisie to make everybody believe that the imperialist war was a people's war. During the war, the bourgeoisie managed to attain considerable influence in affairs of state and set up a countrywide organization of its own known as the Unions of Zemstvios and Towns. It was necessary for the bourgeoisie to bring the workers, too, under its leadership and influence. It conceived a way to do this, namely, by forming workers' groups of the war industry committees. The Mensheviks jumped at this idea. It was to the advantage of the bourgeoisie to have on these war industry committees representatives of the workers who would urge the working class masses to increase productivity of labor in the factories producing shells, guns, rifles, cartridges and other war material. Everything for the war, all for the war, was the slogan of the bourgeoisie. Actually, this slogan meant, get as rich as you can on war contracts and seizures of foreign territory. The Mensheviks took an active part in this pseudo-patriotic scheme of the bourgeoisie. They helped the capitalists by conducting an intense campaign among the workers to get them to take part in the elections of the workers' groups of the war industry committees. The Bolsheviks were against this scheme. They advocated a boycott of the war industry committees and were successful in securing this boycott. But some of the workers, headed by a prominent Menshevik, Gvozdev, and an agent provocateur, Abrosimov, did take part in the activities of the war industry committees. When, however, the workers' delegates met, in September 1915, for the final elections of the workers' groups of the war industry committees, it turned out that the majority of the delegates were opposed to participation in them. A majority of the workers' delegates adopted a trenchant resolution opposing participation in the war industry committees and declared that the workers had made it their aim to fight for peace and for the overthrow of TSRDM. The Bolsheviks also developed extensive activities in the army and navy. They explained to the soldiers and sailors who was to blame for the unparalleled horrors of the war and the sufferings of the people. They explained that there was only one way out for the people from the imperialist shambles, and that was revolution. The Bolsheviks formed nuclei in the army and navy, at the front and in the rear, and distributed leaflets calling for a fight against the war. In Kronstadt, the Bolsheviks formed a central collective of the Kronstadt military organization, which had close connections with the Petrograd Committee of the party. A military organization of the Petrograd Party Committee was set up for work among the garrison. In August 1916, the chief of the Petrograd Okhrana reported that, in the Kronstadt collective, things are very well organized, conspiratorially, and its members are all taciturn and cautious people. This collective also has representatives on shore. At the front, the party agitated for fraternization between the soldiers of the warring armies, emphasizing the fact that the world bourgeoisie was the enemy, and that the war could be ended only by converting the imperialist war into a civil war and turning one's weapons against one's own bourgeoisie and its government. Cases of refusal of army units to take the offensive became more and more frequent. There were already such instances in 1915, and even more in 1916. Particularly extensive were the activities of the Bolsheviks in the armies on the Northern Front, in the Baltic provinces. At the beginning of 1917, General Ruski, commander of the army on the Northern Front, informed headquarters that the Bolsheviks had developed intense revolutionary activities on that front. The war wrought a profound change in the life of the peoples, in the life of the working class of the world. The fate of states, the fate of nations, the fate of the socialist movement was at stake. The war was therefore a touchstone, a test for all parties and trends calling themselves socialist. Would these parties and trends remain true to the cause of socialism, to the cause of internationalism, or would they choose to betray the working class, to furl their banners and lay them at the feet of their national bourgeoisie? That is how the question stood at the time. The war showed that the parties of the Second International had not stood the test, that they had betrayed the working class and had surrendered their banners to the imperialist bourgeoisie of their own countries. And these parties, which had cultivated opportunism in their midst, and which had been brought up to make concessions to the opportunists, to the nationalists, could not have acted differently. The war showed that the Bolshevik Party was the only party which had passed the test with flying colors and had remained consistently faithful to the cause of socialism, the cause of proletarian internationalism. And that was to be expected. Only a party of a new type, only a party fostered in the spirit of uncompromising struggle against opportunism, only a party that was free from opportunism and nationalism, only such a party could stand the great test and remain faithful to the cause of the working class, to the cause of socialism and internationalism. And the Bolshevik Party was such a party. 4. Defeat of the Tsarist army, economic disruption, crisis. Of TSARDOM. The war had already been in progress for 3 years. Millions of people had been killed in the war, or had died of wounds or from epidemics caused by war conditions. The bourgeoisie and landlords were making fortunes out of the war. But the workers and peasants were suffering increasing hardship and privation. The war was undermining the economic life of Russia. Some 14 million able-bodied men had been torn from economic pursuits and drafted into the army. Mills and factories were coming to a standstill. The crop area had diminished owing to a shortage of labor. The population and the soldiers at the front went hungry, barefoot and naked. The war was eating up the resources of the country. The Tsarist army suffered defeat after defeat. The German artillery deluged the Tsarist troops with shells, while the Tsarist army lacked guns, shells and even rifles. Sometimes 3 soldiers had to share 1 rifle. While the war was in progress, it was discovered that Sukhomlinov, the Tsar's Minister of War, was a traitor, who was connected with German spies, and was carrying out the instructions of the German espionage service to disorganize the supply of munitions and to leave the front without guns and rifles. Some of the Tsarist ministers and generals surreptitiously assisted the success of the German army. Together with the Tsarina, who had German ties, they betrayed military secrets to the Germans. It is not surprising that the Tsarist army suffered reverses and was forced to retreat. By 1916 the Germans had already seized Poland and part of the Baltic provinces. All this aroused hatred and anger against the Tsarist government among the workers, peasants, soldiers and intellectuals, fostered and intensified the revolutionary movement of the masses against the war and against TSRDom, both in the rear and at the front, in the central and in the border regions. Dissatisfaction also began to spread to the Russian imperialist bourgeoisie. It was incensed by the fact that rascals like Rasputin, who were obviously working for a separate peace with Germany, lorded it at the Tsar's court. The bourgeoisie grew more and more convinced that the Tsarist government was incapable of waging war successfully. It feared that the Tsar might, in order to save his position, conclude a separate peace with the Germans. The Russian bourgeoisie therefore decided to engineer a palace coup with the object of deposing Tsar Nicholas II and replacing him by his brother, Michael Romanov, who was connected with the bourgeoisie. In this way it wanted to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. First, to get into power itself and ensure the further prosecution of the imperialist war, and, secondly, to prevent by a small palace coup the outbreak of a big popular revolution, the tide of which was swelling. In this the Russian bourgeoisie had the full support of the British and French governments, who saw that the Tsar was incapable of carrying on the war. They feared that he might end it by concluding a separate peace with the Germans. If the Tsarist government were to sign a separate peace, the British and French governments would lose a war ally which not only diverted enemy forces to its own fronts, but also supplied France with tens of thousands of picked Russian soldiers. The British and French governments therefore supported the attempts of the Russian bourgeoisie to bring about a palace coup. The Tsar was thus isolated. While defeat followed defeat at the front, economic disruption grew more and more acute. In January and February 1917, the extent and acuteness of the disorganization of the food, raw material and fuel supply reached a climax. The supply of foodstuffs to Petrograd and Moscow had almost ceased. One factory after another closed down, and this aggravated unemployment. Particularly intolerable was the condition of the workers. Increasing numbers of the people were arriving at the conviction that the only way out of the intolerable situation was to overthrow the Tsarist autocracy. Tsardom was clearly in the throes of a mortal crisis. The bourgeoisie thought of solving the crisis by a palace coup. But the people solved it in their own way. 5. The February Revolution. Fall of TSARDOM, formation of Soviets of workers and soldiers, deputies, formation of the provisional government, dual power. The year 1917 was inaugurated by the strike of January 9. In the course of this strike, demonstrations were held in Petrograd, Moscow, Baku and Nizhny Novgorod. In Moscow, about 1/3 of the workers took part in the strike of January 9. A demonstration of 2,000 persons on Tverskoy Boulevard was dispersed by mounted police. A demonstration on the Vyborg Chaussee in Petrograd was joined by soldiers. The idea of a general strike, the Petrograd police reported, is daily gaining new followers and is becoming as popular as it was in 1905. The Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries tried to direct this incipient revolutionary movement into the channels the liberal bourgeoisie needed. The Mensheviks proposed that a procession of workers to the State Duma be organized on February 14, the day of its opening. But the working-class masses followed the Bolsheviks and went, not to the Duma, but to a demonstration. On February 18, 1917, a strike broke out at the Putilov works in Petrograd. On February 22, the workers of most of the big factories were on strike. On International Women's Day, February 23, March 8, at the call of the Petrograd Bolshevik Committee, working women came out in the streets to demonstrate against starvation, war and TSRdom. The Petrograd workers supported the demonstration of the working women by a city-wide strike movement. The political strike began to grow into a general political demonstration against the Tsarist system. On February 24, March 9, the demonstration was resumed with even greater vigor. About 200,000 workers were already on strike. On February 25, March 10, the whole of working-class Petrograd had joined the revolutionary movement. The political strikes in the districts merged into a general political strike of the whole city. Demonstrations and clashes with the police took place everywhere. Over the masses of workers floated red banners bearing the slogans, "Down with the Tsar, down with the war, we want bread." On the morning of February 26, March 11, the political strike and demonstration began to assume the character of an uprising. The workers disarmed police and gendarmes and armed themselves. Nevertheless, the clashes with the police ended with the shooting down of a demonstration on Znamenskaya Square. General Kabalev, commander of the Petrograd military area, announced that the workers must return to work by February 28, March 13, otherwise they would be sent to the front. On February 25, March 10, the Tsar gave orders to General Kabalev, "I command you to put a stop to the disorders in the capital not later than tomorrow." But to put a stop to the revolution was no longer possible. On February 26, March 11, the 4th Company of the Reserve Battalion of the Pavlovsky Regiment opened fire, not on the workers, however, but on squads of mounted police who were engaged in a skirmish with the workers. A most energetic and persistent drive was made to win over the troops, especially by the working women, who addressed themselves directly to the soldiers, fraternized with them and called upon them to help the people to overthrow the hated Tsarist autocracy. The practical work of the Bolshevik Party at that time was directed by the Bureau of the Central Committee of our party, which had its quarters in Petrograd and was headed by Comrade Molotov. On February 26, March 11, the Bureau of the Central Committee issued a manifesto calling for the continuation of the armed struggle against TSRdom and the formation of a provisional revolutionary government. On February 27, March 12, the troops in Petrograd refused to fire on the workers and began to line up with the people in revolt. The number of soldiers who had joined the revolt by the morning of February 27 was still no more than 10,000, but by the evening it already exceeded 60,000. The workers and soldiers who had risen in revolt began to arrest Tsarist ministers and generals and to free revolutionaries from jail. The released political prisoners joined the revolutionary struggle. In the streets, shots were still being exchanged with police and gendarmes posted with machine guns in the attics of houses. But the troops rapidly went over to the side of the workers, and this decided the fate of the Tsarist autocracy. When the news of the victory of the revolution in Petrograd spread to other towns and to the front, the workers and soldiers everywhere began to depose the Tsarist officials. The February bourgeois democratic revolution had won. The revolution was victorious because its vanguard was the working class, which headed the movement of millions of peasants clad in soldiers' uniform demanding peace, bread and liberty. It was the hegemony of the proletariat that determined the success of the revolution. The revolution was made by the proletariat. The proletariat displayed heroism, it shed its blood, it swept along with it the broadest masses of the toiling and poor population, wrote Lenin in the early days of the revolution. Lenin, Collected Works, Rus. ed. Volume 20, pp. 23-4. The first revolution, that of 1905, had prepared the way for the swift success of the second revolution, that of 1917. Without the tremendous class battles, Lenin wrote, and the revolutionary energy displayed by the Russian proletariat during the 3 years, 1905-07, the second revolution could not possibly have been so rapid in the sense that its initial stage was completed in a few days. Lenin, Selected Works, Volume V, pp. 3-4. Soviets arose in the very first days of the revolution. The victorious revolution rested on the support of the Soviets of workers and soldiers. Deputies. The workers and soldiers who rose in revolt created Soviets. From Marx to Mao, not for commercial distribution of workers and soldiers deputies. The revolution of 1905 had shown that the Soviets were organs of armed uprising and at the same time the embryo of a new, revolutionary power. The idea of Soviets lived in the minds of the working-class masses, and they put it into effect as soon as TSRDM was overthrown, with this difference, however, that in 1905 it was Soviets only of workers' deputies that were formed, whereas in February 1917, on the initiative of the Bolsheviks, there arose Soviets of workers' and soldiers' deputies. While the Bolsheviks were directly leading the struggle of the masses in the streets, the compromising parties, the Mensheviks and Socialist Revolutionaries, were seizing the seats in the Soviets, and building up a majority there. This was partly facilitated by the fact that the majority of the leaders of the Bolshevik Party were in prison or exile. Lenin was in exile abroad and Stalin and Sverdlov in banishment in Siberia, while the Mensheviks and Socialist Revolutionaries were freely promenading the streets of Petrograd. The result was that the Petrograd Soviet and its executive committee were headed by representatives of the compromising parties, Mensheviks and Socialist Revolutionaries. This was also the case in Moscow and a number of other cities. Only in Ivanovo-Voznesensk, Krasnoyarsk and a few other places did the Bolsheviks have a majority in the Soviets from the very outset. The armed people, the workers and soldiers, sent their representatives to the Soviet as to an organ of power of the people. They thought and believed that the Soviet of workers and soldiers' deputies would carry out all the demands of the revolutionary people, and that, in the first place, peace would be concluded. But the unwarranted trustfulness of the workers and soldiers served them in evil stead. The Socialist Revolutionaries and Mensheviks had not the slightest intention of terminating the war, of securing peace. They planned to take advantage of the revolution to continue the war. As to the revolution and the revolutionary demands of the people, the Socialist Revolutionaries and the Mensheviks considered that the revolution was already over, and that the task now was to seal it and to pass to a normal, constitutional existence side by side with the bourgeoisie. The Socialist Revolutionary and Menshevik leaders of the Petrograd Soviet therefore did their utmost to shelve the question of terminating the war, to shelve the question of peace, and to hand over the power to the bourgeoisie. On February 27, March 12, 1917, the liberal members of the Fourth State Duma, as the result of a backstairs agreement with the Socialist Revolutionary and Menshevik leaders, set up a provisional committee of the State Duma, headed by Rodzianko, the president of the Duma, a landlord and a monarchist. And a few days later, the Provisional Committee of the State Duma and the Socialist Revolutionary and Menshevik leaders of the Executive Committee of the Soviet of Workers and Soldiers deputies, acting secretly from the Bolsheviks, came to an agreement to form a new government of Russia, a bourgeois provisional government, headed by Prince Lvov, the man whom, prior to the February Revolution, even Tsar Nicholas II was about to make the prime minister of his government. The provisional government included Milikov, the head of the Constitutional Democrats, Guchkov, the head of the Octobrists, and other prominent representatives of the capitalist class, and, as the representative of the democracy, the Socialist Revolutionary Kerensky. And so it was that the Socialist Revolutionary and Menshevik leaders of the Executive Committee of the Soviet surrendered the power to the bourgeoisie. Yet when the Soviet of Workers and Soldiers deputies learned of this, its majority formally approved of the action of the Socialist Revolutionary and Menshevik leaders, despite the protest of the Bolsheviks. Thus a new state power arose in Russia, consisting, as Lenin said, of representatives of the bourgeoisie and landlords who had become bourgeois. But alongside of the bourgeois government there existed another power, the Soviet of Workers and Soldiers deputies. The soldier deputies on the Soviet were mostly peasants who had been mobilized for the war. The Soviet of Workers and Soldiers deputies was an organ of the alliance of workers and peasants against the Tsarist regime, and at the same time it was an organ of their power, an organ of the dictatorship of the working class and the peasantry. The result was a peculiar interlocking of two powers, of two dictatorship, the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, represented by the provisional government, and the dictatorship of the proletariat and peasantry, represented by the Soviet of Workers and Soldiers deputies. The result was a dual power. How is it to be explained that the majority in the Soviets at first consisted of Mensheviks and Socialist Revolutionaries? How is it to be explained that the victorious workers and peasants voluntarily surrendered the power to the representatives of the bourgeoisie? Lenin explained it by pointing out that millions of people, inexperienced in politics, had awakened and pressed forward to political activity. These were for the most part small owners, peasants, workers who had recently been peasants, people who stood midway between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. Russia was at that time the most petty bourgeois of all the big European countries. And in this country, a gigantic petty bourgeois wave has swept over everything and overwhelmed the class-conscious proletariat, not only by force of numbers but also ideologically. That is, it has infected and imbued very wide circles of workers with the petty bourgeois political outlook. Lenin. Selected Works, Volume V, page 49. It was this elemental petty bourgeois wave that swept the petty bourgeois Menshevik and Socialist Revolutionary parties to the fore. Lenin pointed out that another reason was the change in the composition of the proletariat that had taken place during the war and the inadequate class consciousness and organization of the proletariat at the beginning of the revolution. During the war, big changes had taken place in the proletariat itself. About 40% of the regular workers had been drafted into the army. Many small owners, artisans and shopkeepers, to whom the proletarian psychology was alien, had gone to the factories in order to evade mobilization. It was these petty bourgeois sections of the workers that formed the soil which nourished the petty bourgeois politicians, the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries. That is why large numbers of the people, inexperienced in politics, swept into the elemental petty bourgeois vortex, and intoxicated with the first successes of the revolution, found themselves in its early months under the sway of the compromising parties and consented to surrender the state power to the bourgeoisie in the naive belief that a bourgeois power would not hinder the Soviets in their work. The task that confronted the Bolshevik Party was, by patient work of explanation, to open the eyes of the masses to the imperialist character of the provisional government, to expose the treachery of the socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks, and to show that peace could not be secured unless the provisional government were replaced by a government of Soviets. And to this work the Bolshevik Party addressed itself with the utmost energy. It resumed the publication of its legal periodicals. The newspaper, Pravda, appeared in Petrograd 5 days after the February Revolution, and the Social Democrat in Moscow a few days later. The party was assuming leadership of the masses, who were losing their confidence in the liberal bourgeoisie and in the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries. It patiently explained to the soldiers and peasants the necessity of acting jointly with the working class. It explained to them that the peasants would secure neither peace nor land unless the revolution were further developed and the bourgeois provisional government replaced by a government of Soviets. BRIEFSUMMARY. The imperialist war arose owing to the uneven development of the capitalist countries, to the upsetting of equilibrium between the principal powers, to the imperialists' need for a redivision of the world by means of war and for the creation of a new equilibrium. The war would not have been so destructive, and perhaps would not even have assumed such dimensions, if the parties of the Second International had not betrayed the cause of the working class, if they had not violated the anti-war decisions of the Congresses of the Second International, if they had dared to act and to rouse the working class against their imperialist governments, against the warmongers. The Bolshevik Party was the only proletarian party which remained faithful to the cause of socialism and internationalism and which organized civil war against its own imperialist government. All the other parties of the Second International, being tied to the bourgeoisie through their leaders, found themselves under the sway of imperialism and deserted to the side of the imperialists. The war, while it was a reflection of the general crisis of capitalism, at the same time aggravated this crisis and weakened world capitalism. The workers of Russia and the Bolshevik Party were the first in the world successfully to take advantage of the weakness of capitalism. They forced a breach in the imperialist front, overthrew the Tsar and set up Soviets of workers and soldiers deputies. Intoxicated by the first successes of the revolution, and lulled by the assurances of the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries that from now on everything would go well, the bulk of the petty bourgeoisie, the soldiers, as well as the workers, placed their confidence in the provisional government and supported it. The Bolshevik Party was confronted with the task of explaining to the masses of workers and soldiers, who had been intoxicated by the first successes, that the complete victory of the revolution was still a long way off, that as long as the power was in the hands of the bourgeois provisional government, and as long as the Soviets were dominated by the compromisers, the Mensheviks and socialist revolutionaries, the people would secure neither peace, nor land, nor bread, and that in order to achieve complete victory, one more step had to be taken and the power transferred to the Soviets.